Welcome back to the Satyajit Centenary seminar. This is the second day of the seminar. Some of you were present on the first day as well, but some of you may be joining today only. We have two speakers this evening or this morning, depending on where you are, Anindo Sengupta and Pinaki De. Those of you who do not know the format of the seminar, let me very briefly explain. The speakers will take 45 minutes to present, and then a 15-minute question-answer session will follow. So we have 1 hour set aside for each speaker, roughly. We will begin with Anindo Sengupta, the present head of the Department of Film Studies. And I would request my colleague, Dr. Manoj Ghosh, to briefly introduce Anindo Sengupta. Then Anindo will start.
Dr. Anindo Sengupta is Assistant Professor at the Department of Film Studies, Jadavpur University. He did his doctoral thesis on auteur criticism and Satyajit Ray. He has also written a science fiction novel titled Aparthibo. The title of the presentation of Dr. Sengupta is Time Out of Joint on Decoding Auteur Codes in Opur Sangsar 1959. Over to Anindo.
Good evening, viewers, and good evening, everyone who's present here right now. And without much ado, I will start reading my paper today. So, the title is, as Manoj said, Time Out of Joint on Decoding Auteur Codes in Opur Sangsar 1959. In a collection of essays, articles, interviews, and anecdotes related to Satyajit Ray's films, the editors conclude that Opur Sangsar is set in the 1930s. I'm referring to Pachali Theke Oscar, edited by Ujjwal Chakraborty. This is the book, edited by Ujjwal Chakraborty, Aniruddha Dhar, and Atanu Chakraborty. And they say that because there is no direct reference in the film, they worked out this setting, this time, to be in 1930s. They derived the possible date from numerous clues strewn all over the film. For example, Opu's refusal to take a job at the railways because authorities were replacing workers who were on strike. The editors inform us that in December 1936, a massive worker strike occurred in the railways when the authorities did think of replacing the workers with newer recruits, even with the retired ones. Manovendranath Rai supported the workers at the 1936 Faichpur Congress, presided over by Jawaharlal Nehru. The editors also noted that the portraits of three eminent personalities who adorned young Opu's room are of Rabindranath Tagore, Einstein, and Jagadish Chandra Bose. It was in the 1930s when Jagadish Chandra Bose lectured in Kolkata to demonstrate similarities between plants and animal life. The Nandalal Bose composition, which adorns Opu's walls, were painted on the occasion of Haripura Convention of the Congress in 1938. Ujjwal Chakraborty, in the same anthology, even points out that Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay went to view Pramotesh Barua's Mukti in 1938 with a female acquaintance, which is the time around which the married Opu and Aparna go to watch a Hindi mythology based on Dhruva's story. Curiously, the editors missed one, we quote, direct reference in the film, which dates Opur Sangsar somewhat differently. And I will now show you the image. And So we are referring to this particular letter, which is shown in close shot, and this is the date. Curiously, the editors missed one direct reference in the film, which dates Opus Samshar somewhat differently. It is in the close-up of a letter which acknowledges Opus' publication of a short story in a periodical. The letter, recognizably written in raised longhand, is dated 11/8/1943. In the previous film, there was this place and date marker, Varanasi 1327 according to the Bengali calendar, and 1920 in the Gregorian calendar. And the same anthology which I was referring to, it also had this writing notes by Satyajit Ray, which says that in his notes, working notes, Ray dates Aparajita from 1920 to 1925. Let me stop the presentation right now. So Ray's working notes dates Aparajita from 1920 to 25. Aparajita begins with a place and date marker, Varanasi 1327. If Opu is around 17 by the end of Aparajita, he will be around 35 if the latter film is set in 1943, a highly unlikely age of the character as we see him on the screen. Now, how do we explain this curious kind of glitch? Is it an error? That too in a shot where the letter is shown in close-up. Unlikely if the director is Ray, who is known to be fastidiously meticulous. This curious date is a fulcrum of my reading of the last film of the trilogy this evening. Now I'm going back to Aparajito, referring to a scene which was referred to by Monishita Das last evening, and everyone knows the scene. One need not to show it again. In Aparajito, Opu coaxes his mother to get him admitted to the village school. That he has proved to be a diligent, brighter kid in the school is proved when he earnestly recites a poem during an inspector's visit to the school. The inspector is visibly moved. The Pather Pachali theme music reappears over his pleased face. The poem is a eulogy of the land and the nature of Bengal. The theme music of the earlier film has surfaced previously in another famous scene, Sarboja's face brightening up when the train from Benares enters Bengal. The recurrence of the music has already gained a semantic charge. The scene of the train returning to the Bengal celebrating the resurfacing of a terrain to which Pather Pachali opened its cinematic eyes too. In the school scene, it is connected to a broader cultural discourse, that of a nationalist celebration of the land and its idealized nature. The next scene, which was showed last evening, shows Opu with the principal and a teacher. The principal, saying that the inspector is very pleased with Opu, advises him regarding further betterment. He must better his command over English and should read books on science, geography, and explorations. We need to read to expand the horizons of our consciousness, he says. We cannot restrict our minds just because we are left in a remote corner of Bengal. Remote corner is said in English, which will be echoed later in the film in an English translation of the word Kupamunduk, a frog in the well. While the poem celebrates the land as the most beautiful of all countries, the principal's asides states that being restricted to its boundaries is a deterrent to the growing up of the mind. Within seconds of time lapse, we see that Opu can meticulously imagine how an African tribal might look like, how the solar eclipse occurs. Monishata Das yesterday compared Aparajito with Aguntuk, and I can also refer to this again, a coincidence one can say, that in Aguntuk also this magic of the solar eclipse was again more elaborately depicted by Ray through Monomohan. The broadening of the mind starts with a series of names, places and names, which immediately expands a local map of the experiential to a global virtual, effectively initiating the aura of explorations and expeditions in which the Opu of the novel wallows in reveries. The image of the globe, as referred to last evening, will now stay as a visual motif of a metalinguistic discourse. I'll be elaborating on this metalinguistic discourse. One might try to examine how a rupture starts from this point, when the Bildungsroman of a movement of consciousness strikes a distance from the intimate originary landscape. This contradiction between the celebration of the land in Bengali and the widening of the mind's horizon, mostly in English, is elaborated in a full-fledged way in Opur Sangsar. As you can recall, the film starts introducing Opu as a young man, that is Opur Sangsar, who is still not free from privation. He cannot continue his education because he cannot afford it, but is glowing with promise and is at ease with urbanity. Though, significantly, as a coda to the first scene, we hear political slogans issuing off the screen as another dimension of the new youth to which Opu does not comfortably align with. Ray drops the overtone of the land in a regular rhythm right from this first scene. Opu's teacher says that he should continue writing. His essay on village life in the college magazine was enjoyable. Opu's first publication in the periodical is titled Matir Manush, Son of the Earth or a Simple Man in translation. As we have noticed earlier, this was rather a first in the entire trilogy. Opu's chosen vocation as a writer was not hinted in the last two films. While in the novel, a child Opu dreamt about writing plays like his father, Ray has consciously avoided it, writing and Opu's dreams of being a writer in the earlier film. So in Oporajito, Opu was a typical science student, and in the later film, he is a typical humanities art student in that sense. In the last film of the trilogy, it is established in the first scene and remains an important element throughout. Thus, in Opur Sangsar, the Bildungsroman turns into a burgeoning Kunstleroman. Here, one must go back to the education sequence of Oporajito. The contradiction between the pastoral celebration of land, which can be done only through local language, writing about a land idyllically, a literary land which exists only in words, a nationalist imaginary, was offset by the centrifugal drive away from the matrix through language again, this time in English, to stretch the limits of consciousness. This contradiction is then played out in Oporajito through the narrative of a rift between the mother and the son's irreversible movement towards the yearning of modernity, and the mother's desolation and despondency, making her metonymic to the rural local. In Opur Sangsar, this contradiction is seemingly resolved. Opu can now convincingly, evocatively write about his rural childhood in Bangla only because he is thoroughly urbanized, bilingual, and lodged in the present. He has gained a sort of agency through language, which makes good of the earlier rift. While in Oporajito, Opu was yearning for a place in the symbolic, it is the symbolic which has now gifted Opu with a point of narcissistic identification, a poor urban youth who can joyously write about the pastoral plenty. Ray plays on these ideas. When Pulu entices him to a visit to Khulna, he catalogues a series of urban cliches about the idyllic pastoral rural. Opu's gleeful laughter cannot be easily explained. Are the cliches enticing him like an urban tourist because he is already distant from them? Or are the cliches falling short because he knows the rural life too intimately? Is this the kid of Pother Pachali laughing? Or is it the teenager of the latter half of Oporajito who has finally shed off his baggage? Pulu's affectionate teasing and Opu's laughter immediately dissolves into a recitation by an indulgent Opu, well fed after thanks to his richer engineer friend. The poem strikes a curious metalinguistic reflexive note. Let me show a screenshot of the poem. Most probably you can recall. This is the poem. This is the poem. Rabindranath Tagore's Boshundhara is a poem about a subject divorced from the land, being suffocated and trapped within the cage of an unhinged body. And the trajectory from Satyendranath Datta's pain to the best of the countries/lands to Tagore's despondency of the one disconnected from the land via Pulu's cliches to strike a metalinguistic overtone which also distantiates itself from Vibhuti Bhushan. In this paper, I will underline this strand, a sort of troubled relationship of the modern man with the land via through language. Here one should recall how, after the death of Aparna, Opu drifts like an unhinged kite across terrains, seaside, mountains, forests, mines, unable to anchor himself to any place, unable to return to the land he so celebrated in his early writings. We never hear Opu's writings. We hear his synopsis, which is hardly about the village life he wrote in his college magazine or in his first publication. Instead, the elated synopsis he presents to Pulu, his wonderful autobiographical novel, is about the romance of a male self with modernity, with a celebration of reason and individualism, exactly presenting the subject of the seamless arrival at the modern, which Gita Kapoor delineated as the ideological infrastructure of the trilogy in her landmark essay, later anthologized as a chapter in her book, When Was Modernism? In other words, the 1959 film was already aware of the 1992 critic. Gita Kapoor's essay came in Journal of Arts and Ideas in 1992, because the film has already struck a critical distance from the jubilant young man. Opu's Joie de Vivre celebrates the achievements of education and learning to gloss over the losses. It is not entirely ironic that he never mentions his mother, sister, or old aunt in the synopsis. He mentions only his priest brother, whom he has outgrown. It will be ironic that when this narcissistic celebration of this new life shatters, the cause will be the death of the only remaining woman in his life. He never understood the death of Inder Thakur. He was asleep when his sister died in his mother's arms. He was not there by his mother when she died alone. Aparna's death will also be reported to him. Not only has he sleepwalked through a history of deaths, his mourning have remained incomplete. He never understood that each of these deaths not only signified the passing of his yesteryears, but also means alienation from the nurturing matrix, which he thinks now is attainable through language, the plenitudinal rural Bengal. Where does the value of Aparna as the final woman lie in this schema? Let us recall a subtle motive Ray used, something one could even overlook. Let me present you again certain images. So it starts with this book. Opu kept a dried leaf. You can see it peeping up from the book. Probably a frond of a fern in his volume of 8 jewels is the outline of history. So the book, this is the leaf. And this is the touching of the leaf, which is important for us. Later, during his bereavement, Opu floats in the forest. And here, if you go and watch this scene very carefully, you should notice the use of the telephoto lens, which kind of blurs the setting and literally disassociates the figure from the ground. Opu looks blankly across at the surroundings, and the surrounding is almost blurred. Later, during his bereavement, Opu floats in a forest, his blank eyes almost registering nothing, and he touches a similar frond. The touch now signifies alienation than familiarity. He has lost the touch with nature. He thought he has archived the touch between the pages of his book. This touch is bound to recall Sarbojoya touching an asleep Opu in Aparajito and being shocked of something familiar. Probably Sarbojoya understood what this unfamiliar is through the touch. Opu seems not even able to perceive what has defamiliarized. Coming back. What does the leaf between the pages stand for? And here there is also a kind of visual pun. Okay, let me return back to the presentation again. Just 2 images might be. That is, when Opu abandons the novel, there is also a similar motif of the touch. And here are the pages of the novel floating around. And there is most probably a pun, a visual pun on the Bengali word pata, which simultaneously means pages and also lives. So lives and pages. Where does the value of Aparna as the final woman lie in the schema? Let us recall the subtle motive Ray used, which I talked about. Now, what does this leave between the pages stand for? There might be a hint of a mythic connotation. One can compare the widower Opus wanderings with that of Lord Shiva after Shoti's death. Aparna is another name of Shoti. The Purana says that Shoti was a devotee of Shiva. She gave up the comfort of her royal existence and went to the forest for penances. Her devotion and desire for her future husband was so intense that in the climactic stage of her penance, she subsisted on a single leaf each day. Ekti pata kheten. A single leaf each day, thus bestowed with the name Aparna. I would argue the leaf to be an object petiya, a fallen detached part of a larger other which one holds to, but which also signify alienation from the real. Here, the plenitudinal nature of Bengal. I would argue that Aparna's status in the film is exactly like the leaf. She is the little bit of the idyllic rural Bengal in the metropolis. That little bit of fantasy after the matrix is engulfed into the symbolic order of the traumatic history of the nation. She now stands as the fantastic one half of the dreamiest couple in Bengali cinema, formed out of one of its most outrageous instances of arranged marriage. She is a spouse who would rather forego money and subsistence as a concern to gain more of her young husband's company, while Sharbojaya and Huriyar would always talk about money when they meet once in months. Aparna Das is a fantasy who would be inaccessible after leaving her trace in a child who now will traumatically signify her non-existence to Opu. What Gita Kapoor in her critique has probably missed is Opu's abandonment of the manuscript of his novel and what it signifies in the schemata and the depiction of the grief which is different from the aftermath of the earlier deaths in the trilogy. Contemporary critics and viewers were unhappy with the scene of the abandonment of the manuscript, which is radically opposite to the novel where Opu remains with it and completes it. We do not witness any funeral rites after Aparna's death. Instead, we watch a bereaved Opu attempting suicide in a sequence which is considerably violent in its intensity, finding its place in a trilogy famous for its gentle lyricism. Opu tries to lay himself down before an arriving locomotive. As he closes his eyes and prepares himself for the act, a squeal of a piglet startles him. It has been crushed instead. However, just before this shot, Ray does something which is unprecedented in his film Uber. The camera tracks in, moving past Opu's close-up and stares at a bleached-out sky. The shrill whistle of the train increases in volume, bringing back memories of all those scenes of locomotives we have seen in the films, and the screen goes entirely blank for around 20 seconds before we are tracked back, Opu's face reappearing. Only a trail of smoke emerges at the lower left of the screen. After the failed suicide attempt, Opu stands broken as the freight train moves away. The train exits the frame. Opu exits too. At a distance, a tall chimney of a factory spews urban smoke. The scene dissolves to Opu writing to Pulu that he is living for an aimless wonder, taking his incomplete manuscript to be completed. I will just show you this scene because I'm particularly tempted to show you the almost 20 seconds of bleached out image. Sorry, I think the sound is gone. Let me stop it. Oh, it was there. Sorry. It arrived later. Let me start it again. So the close-up of this letter cuts to three shots: a train moving towards the camera, and a train moving away from the camera, with a medium shot of Opu inside the train in the middle. The montage of wandering Opu will shortly follow, climaxing in the abandonment of the manuscript. How do you read this abandonment of the novel? The shots of the trains, the empty screen, the evacuation of the visual, the trail of the chimney smoke. If you recall the accumulated value the images of locomotives have gathered in the films, and the iconic value of the factory in the arriving New India, and put them beside Opu's disconnect, both from the rural and the urban spaces, the portrait of this urban individual is not a very positive one. Not one of sublimating progress as Geeta Kapoor and many others have described, but rather of precarity. The manuscript of Opu's novel should be read as a nascent Pather Pachali, which the author abandons, also as the abandonment of a certain hopeful vision of life's achievements via history's trajectory. Moreover, if one stretches authoristic readings a bit far, the manuscript might also stand for the popular perception of the first novel, first film, that is Pather Pachali, and which even continues, and which is confirmed in the centenary year, that Pather Pachali as a nostalgic kind of film, and the novel it was adapted from, Pather Pachali as we culturally remember. This entire perception is abandoned. It was all these cultural semantic values which are being abandoned by Opu in a state of desolation and despair. This is neither sublimation nor progress. An extended scene where Pulu meets Opu near a mine just after this, somewhere in Bihar, has a more striking sonic design. Now I'll particularly draw attention to the sound. I will show the clip. Pulu persuades Opu to take responsibility of the child. Opu says he cannot, he is sending money anyway. Kajol does not exist to him because he has not even seen his son. When Pulu is taking his leave, we find Opu in a state of torment. He will now change his mind and visit his son. The soundtrack in the course throws up a couple of strange elements. Distant sounds of tribal festivals emerge when Opu's neurosis intensifies and abruptly stops when he breaks down to explain that he cannot negotiate the fact that Kajol signifies Opna's death to him. The scene continues with the sounds of chirping of crickets, which we associate more readily with the villages of Bengal than the landscape before us on the screen. The last element of the distant howling of the foxes recalls Nishchindipur's nights and gathers ominous value when it is followed by a music which appeared during the last scene of Sharbojaya in Oporajito when she hallucinates Opu's call. What is important in this designing of the sound cannot be read as an underlining of the character's psychology. The oral intertextuality is not hinting at Opu's realization that he is getting disconnected from his son like his mother. Rather, it is functioning at the meta-narrative level, recalling and associating disparate incidents and elements from the earlier films and giving shape to a viewer's consciousness in the process of making meaning. Let me show you the clip. Now, sorry, there are no subtitles, but I think we don't need the subtitles because you need to pay attention to the sound.
চলে যা ভাবছি ভালো লাগছে না কোথায় যাবি বাইরে কোথাও টাকা জমাচ্ছি তুই একাই যাবি আর কে আছে কেন কাজল কে কাজল কাজল তোর ছেলে ও ওর নাম কাজল বুঝি অপু 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 শোন কি বলছিস তুই দেশে ফিরে যা কেন ছেলেটাকে মানুষ করতে হবে তো ওকে দেখবার তো কেউ নেই আর তাছাড়া তুই তো ছেলের বাপ তোর ডিউটি বলেও তো একটা জিনিস আছে নাকি সেটাকে উপন্যাসের মতো জলাঞ্জলি দিয়েছিস ডিউটি ডিউটি করছি না তোকে বলেছে কে টাকাগুলো পাঠাচ্ছে কে ওতেই হয়ে গেল ওর চেয়ে বেশি কিছু করা সম্ভব না কি বলছিস? তোর নিজের ছেলের উপর তোর কোনো টান নেই?
না, টানটা হবে কোথেকে শুনি? আমি তো তাকে চোখেই দেখিনি। আমার কাছে সে অবাস্তব, অলিক। আমার কাছে তার কোনো অস্তিত্বই নেই।
মাথা খারাপ হয়ে গেছে। আমার ডিউটি আমি করে দিয়ে গেলাম, এখন তুমি যা ভালো বোঝো করো। চলি।
হলো,
কি বলছিস?
শোন,
7টার গাড়ি ধরতে হবে।
শুনে যা।
বল।
তুই ছেলেটার জন্য কিছু করে দে না, কোনো বোর্ডিং এ টোডিং এ।
সেটা তো তুমিও করতে পারো।
না,
না কেন?
আমার পক্ষে করা সম্ভব নয়।
কেন সম্ভব নয়? কেন সেটাই তো আমি বুঝতে পারছি না।
একটা কথা আমি কিছুতেই ভুলতে পারি না। কাজল আছে বলে অপর্ণা নেই। আমি 3বার টাকা পাঠিয়েছি, দরকার হলে আরো পাঠাতে পারি, এর বেশি কিছু করা। তাছাড়া আর আমি দায়িত্ব নিতে পারবো না। আমি তো বলছি ওর উপর কোনো দরদ আমার নেই। তোমার যদি মনে হয় ওর কোনো দেখাশোনা হচ্ছে না, তুমি ওর একটা ব্যবস্থা করে দাও, আমি খরচটা দিতে রাজি আছি। টাকা দিয়ে দেবো?
লাভ নেই, পরশু আমায় কাজে জয়েন করতে হবে। আপাতত আমার পক্ষে কিছু করা সম্ভব হচ্ছে না। চলি।
হুলু, হুলু, হুলু।
I'm not sure if the sound is properly heard because digital compression actually harms the soundtrack more than the image track. Nevertheless, let's continue. However, how do we explain the sudden emergence of the tribal music? In the previous year, Ritik Ghatak's Ajantrik used an extended passage of the Orao dance and music in an enigmatic way, underlining the protagonist's alienation from the car he invested in so much, and also his disassociation from the landscape. The music in that film simultaneously gave a voice to the landscape by associating the tribal chants firmly with it, that is the landscape, and with the bodies hitherto invisible in the margins of the frames, and renders the hero's anthropomorphizing eccentricities irrelevant. Ray himself will use this landscape, its tribal inhabitants, and the music in Oronnet Dinrathi and Aguntuk. But is he intertextually referring to Ghatak's films in 1959? The reference makes sense in the sense that in this scene, the depiction of Opu's disjuncture becomes complete. Here is a man who considered himself as a self-made modern individual, realizing that his divorce from the land he can only engage through a usage of the rhetoric he has abandoned, উপন্যাস ফেলে দিয়েছি কি হবে লিখে, he says. But he is also severed from the past, the matrix of his childhood, and also the depths of he has journeyed through. From the present, that is the writing of the autobiography through which he is making meaning of his being in this world, and from the future, his son. In the film released a year after Ajantri, the tribal music and the landscape presents the same contrapuntal indifference to the predicament of a modern man, and the crickets and foxes evoke the ghost of a landscape. Much has been said about the final frames of the film, Oppu and Kajol together. We'll see that image later at the end of this talk. Much has been said about the final frames of the film. Critics and commentators have even read a perfect picture of optimism in the image of a reconciled father and son moving towards the metropolis, leaving behind the rural past. I'm quoting again Gita Kapoor. Ray allows the protagonist of the Oppu trilogy to redeem himself. He stands at the crossroads extra tall with his child on his shoulder at the end of the last film, Oppu Sangsar. But the apparent uplifting quality of the image clouds a darker condition of its formation, the formation of this image. Kajol only agreed to reconcile when Oppu said that he is his friend who might take him to his father, not his father. And their interaction goes like this. Just a short clip of that conversation, which I think everyone remembers. Sorry for the lack of subtitles, but I will translate them.
কি চাও কাজল? কিছু বলবে?
কোথায় যাচ্ছ?
তুমি আসবে আমার সঙ্গে?
তুমি কলকাতায় যাচ্ছ?
যদি আয়, তুমি আসবে?
আমার বাবার কাছে নিয়ে যাবে?
নিশ্চয়ই।
বাবা আমায় বকবে না?
কেন বলবে কাজল?
আমায় ফেলে চলে যাবে না?
কখনো না।
তুমি কে?
তোমার বন্ধু।
So, the interaction goes on like this. Will you take me to my father? Of course I will. Father won't scold me. Why will he? Will not abandon me? Never. Who are you? I'm your friend. Will you run away with me? The exchange has the verve of a strange ritualistic exchange, like marriage vows, climaxing in a redefinition of the participants. Who are you? What am I to you? Who are you after you have promised what you never will be? I am your friend, and like friends, let's do something delinquent. Let's run away from the guardians. Kajol had interacted belligerently whenever Oppu tried to introduce himself as a father to him. The young kid, looking anachronistically urban, is almost a delinquent little sociopath who is habituated to being beaten up and reprimanded by the elders, and to him the imagined father is an absent, punitive and disciplining figure. The previous scenes have established how he has rejected Oppu as a father, once throwing a stone at him. He has rejected his gifts. Therefore, the final reconciliation rests on a very unstable equilibrium, where the father has to say that he is a friend and has to prove in the future that he is not a punitive agent of disciplining if he wishes to reclaim his identity as a father. The irony is that Oppu Sangsar, literally Opu's family and also Opu's world, is poised for a future by not being a family, without a central maternal figure and with a paternal figure bereft of his symbolic role, towards a precarious utopia. Let us return to the strange date, Opu's story being published in August of 1943, and let me go back to my presentation. Sorry. So this date, let's go back to the date. 1943-44 would be the years in which Ray's Oshoni Sanket, again adapted from a Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay novel, would be set in the context of the Great Famine of Bengal. Janam Mukherjee in War, Famine and the End of the Empire says, meanwhile, quote, meanwhile on the 16th and 17th of August alone, 16th and 17th of 1943, 120 corpses by official count were collected from the streets of Calcutta, unquote. These corpses were of famished rural Indians who arrived at the metropolis like zombies to die on the streets. The letter Opu receives is dated August 11, 1943. 1943 was also the year when Ray joined DJ Kimmers and started working as a visualizer. In his biography, Andrew Robinson says that Ray was particularly apathetic to the famine. Now, I will, there's a long quote which I will not read entirely, but I will highlight two places. Ray, along with most people he knew, did nothing to help the victims, but he always felt a sense of shame about it. And then the next highlight, the reason that he gave for his general indifference at the time was honest, if somewhat shocking. He felt that he was getting established in life. So if one said that I was a little callous about the famine, one wouldn't be far wrong. And then there was a more troubling kind of quote, which I'm reading entirely. They also felt a certain lack of sympathy with the world from which the victims came, with their caste-based mentality that led both to their emotional blackmail of city dwellers and to their fatalistic attitudes. Satyajit felt their suffering and their misery, but he also believed that the old irrational system of the values that had helped to create it must pass. This is more kind of ominous, this entire thing. The second quotation is evident of a rather vexed instance of an urban mind to whom the dying body seemed like an object of a decrepit former India, arriving at the gates of a newer one in demand of food and survival. I'm arriving at the concluding part of my paper. Is there a private authoristic semantics of alienation, guilt and absolution at work in that date, that particular date inscribed in the film, of a self which transformed through the rites of passage, which was the shooting of Pather Pachali? If the date is a private hieroglyphic, how do we read it? Can we read the trilogy differently through this opaque sign of 1943 as an encoding of the historically perplexed self in an interpretation of a modern Indian's alienation from the land during the troubled times? Is Ray encoding his own guilt, his disjunct from the people of his land in 1943 into Opu's event of his first publication titled Matir Manush? Or is it an against the grain reading of the common perception of the novels? It is hard to settle for an assured affirmative. If the date of the publication of Opu's story is 1943, one can guess that the period when the bereaved Opu is attempting suicide, wandering through desperate spaces, trying to complete his novelistic vision of life and losing hope and faith in it is around 1947, when the country is gaining independence and the religious riots are plaguing a balkanized Bengal before and after the partition. In the meantime, Kajol is growing up in absence of his parents. Therefore, the bereavement sense might be read as the codified correlative of what is not being represented, as an overwhelm of affect through the denotated. The sign of 1943 thus triggers large-scale semantic displacements. Aparna's metonymic value, she is an object petia of a lost Bengal, becomes particularly poignant. Ravi Vasudevan comments on the setting of Khulna, quote, before our eyes, a space that had provided a romanticized retreat for the city dweller now acquires the aura of a haunted house, a bhoot bangla, a ghostly form now enveloped in the past, unquote. In a strange twist of logic, Khulna would be in post-1947 East Pakistan when Opu brings his son to Kolkata. The riverine Khulna of Opu's marriage can be read as a fantastic rural Bengal after 1943, and the desolate Khulna Opu takes his boy away from as a land dislocated to another map after 1947. I am not justifying the curious death, but I am trying to think if a subtext regarding the changing relationship of the self with the land via the transformation of the nation is readable in the trilogy, the gateway of the reading being this strange death which appears as an error. If the hieroglyphic is a private code, then it was meant to be then it was not meant to be unraveled, not to be considered essential to interpret the film. Therefore, my reading of this film is also precarious, or to quote Onustup's word last evening, wobbly. I am constructing a fiction of the author this evening. We will never know whether the sign of 1943 was intended or not, but such validation is hardly needed. Only a framework of reading which relies on an intending author will need such biographical validations or relegate the close-up of the letter as an authorial error. Since the sign exists in a text as an authorial occult, I tried to see how the fiction of a possible private hieroglyphic might change the field of the meaning, and how this field might show into sharp relief the processes of critical constructions of the auteur as historically contextualized and contingent acts. The construction of the auteur by the critic is not an additive project which is relayed from one auteurist critic to the next to be continued ad infinitum. The construction of an auteur is part of a critical afterlife of a text or a cluster of texts whose configuration changes via changing reading strategies and, if I may, the changing desire of the critic. In other words, the auteur is what the critic desires him to be. I will end with the last few slides of mine, just as a playful kind of last few. It's not because this final image of the film returned uncannily. This final image of the film returned uncannily last year after lockdown, like this and this. So the strange death, 11/8/1943. Thank you.
Thank you, Anindo. We have 15 minutes discussion. Let me tell you, Shukriyadi, would you like to say something? We saw your comment and also Anushtup's. Let me tell you, no. Okay, thank you. Let me tell the participants in this meeting that this whole session is being streamed live on YouTube. I'm saying this so that you are aware of more audiences and larger number of audience who are watching us. Last night it was about 300 or so watching live, between 200 and 300. Then the recording was viewed by more people. I don't know what is happening today, but yes. Is there any question? Rochana, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Anindo, this was a fantastic paper. It was so rich and so moving, and then of course the interpretive burden was absolutely brilliant, and I find myself very convinced. So what I'm going to say is more like a comment and then maybe one tiny little question. Your reading of the auteur actually reminded me of the way this, of the writings by Andrew Sarris in some ways, so the role of the critic, which is often lost sight of, I think, in the easy bending of the word or to a theory. I mean, we often forget where the word originated and the importance of criticism. And I think you brought that back and put it front and center in your presentation, which was absolutely brilliant. Now there was the famine thing, which I'm convinced by, but that little dialogue that you had between Oppu and Kajol, it reminded me of another dialogue, and it seems to me it's such a Ray favorite to have a little boy speak with an older male figure as a friend, and sometimes he even registered. He has parents register surprise as to why little kids would be drawn to complete strangers like this. So recall Sonar Killa, where Mukul takes off, and you have his father. I forget whether it was in the movie version or in the book version, but the father actually sheds a few tears, saying, "Ototuku chele kichu na jigesh kore chole gelo."
The father sheds his tears in the film also.
Yeah, and then exactly, yes, he cries in both the and then in the end again, you have that the three or the four of them walking out of Sonar Killa, where it's Feluda Topishda taking him back to his family, but really that was the family image that. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about this family of man, and man, with emphasis on man. So little boy growing up to be man, but it really is the family of man, and there are very few. There are no women in it almost. And I just wanted to ask your thoughts about that. That this is looking at a new nation in Pothe Pachali, or imagining the new nation as a family of man, and that continues. Further on in different films. So do you have any thoughts about the nation as a family of man?
I can't answer it actually directly, but what I can recall is the way he adapted Pother Pachali, which is of course a typical Bildungsroman about a male child, but if you see the initial few scenes of the film, then this entire world is built with woman, and then there is after train scene there is a clear rift between the Bildungsroman is not present in Pothe Pachali, but there's a rift between Oppu's trajectory, which will be something else, and Durga takes a non-Bildungsroman trajectory, and this split will be again played out in Aparajita as a mother-son thing. And here to evacuate the systematic slipping away of the woman, and that's something which becomes very kind of almost ominous in the trilogy. That's how one by one the woman slips away, left with the father and the son very precariously, because the son, next time Oppu says that I'm your father, the son will again throw the stone. And in my kind of 1943 thing, if you calculate, then when Kajol will reach his 20s, it will be 1968, when sons all over India will be throwing stones at father parents. Okay, he will reach that age. So the precarity of this family of man, this is something which intrigues me. But I in this tragically I read the other films, connect them to it in a certain kind of way. This much I can say right now.
Anushka has a question.
Hello, Anindo, fantastic paper.
Thank you.
I would like you to elaborate on the concept of friendship. Something as a kind of a modern relation that sort of cuts across the project of modernity,
right?
Bridging the country with the city, between castes, between classes, and things like that. And it sort of resonates punctually across Ray's work. And also, if you can sort of stretch the concept in relation to Rochona Square. Is there an effort to imagine a nation of friends?
Yeah. We need to think about that. What were the friendships depicted in the trilogy was that of Oppu and Pulu might be. Pulu almost being a kind of surrogate father figure in the absence of the father figure. And Pulu, just when Pulu disappears, he never returns in the narrative again. And the entire film, which is so kind of implicated into the familial relations, it ends up in this definition of friendship. Then where do you move from then? They arrives at the concept of the friendship and as a possible relationship of the future, not only between Oppu and Kajol, but also the way you kind of presented it and what happens next. Who are the friends in Shotrita's films after this? I'll have to look to it. Who are the other friends whom we kind of can encounter in his films? We encounter friends in Protidwandi, as far as I can remember. The friend is very important in Jonaranno, whose sister is being pent. And I'll have to think of it. Thank you. Thank you for drawing attention to this notion of friendship. Thank you.
Vishnupriya?
Yes, thanks for the paper. It is just beautiful to listen to your, especially the hieroglyphic that you point to in the middle. And I was wondering whether this, the images you show is also a comment on his relationship to visuality, as opposed to the other senses, because you showed us touch. And I was very struck by the image of coal in the film, coal, so there is vision and sound, and Satyajit Ray is a very, very strong making of the world, particularly what he's doing in 1943, right? He's making the world in visuality, as opposed to touch and smell, which are much more indirectly present in this. And I'm thinking of, and I don't remember this in the earlier on when he brings Aparna back, and she's working with, I think, coal, unune, she's put in the kiln. So the women seem to have, and throughout the trilogy, sort of a relationship to natural substances, and the kind of
and also objects.
They're able to use the sensorium to make the world in a very different way from. Okay, so you've talked about language, but I was wondering if you could say something about visuality.
And tactility. Actually, Moinag, one of Moinag's paper has a passage regarding this images of hands and touch, and also Trinankur, you wrote one article on most probably Oshuni Sanket, regarding the touches. So yeah. But
don't mention, please.
as this in this film, visuality of course is a strong point in that sense, but in this film, tactility and sound also. The clips I kind of showed you, that also gains a certain kind of prominence, and this three touches. And this something haunts me. The touching the little lip, touching the lip in the forest, and also recalling Sarbojar touching Oppu, and the pages, the way the hand pulls out the pages, and then the release of the touch, the way the object, and the way you actually now it helps me. The way you said how the woman in the film, they are actually handling objects and things, and for Oppu, I can't say for the men, but it's this thing slip away, pages slip away, and so forth. And one actually was something which I remember as a recurrent motif is the ghoti. মানে ইন্দ্র ঠাকুরনের ঘটি, যে ঘটিটা কিন্তু this ঘটি was present in most probably the second scene of the film, or second or third of the kind of with little Durga or something like that. The Ghoti was there. So Ghoti is also recurrent, and in Ritatu's death means the Ghoti slipping away. The Ghoti returns back during Horihor's death, the final water which is poured in his dying mouth. We'll think about it. Thank you.
Can I quickly add, Arindo? Sorry, Moina, can I quickly add something? Two other things that definitely come to mind is Shorbojaya fingering literally the Shukhe Thako, the thala.
Yeah.
You know, as she's about to give it over, right? To get some rice. And also in Oshoni Shanket, all the women, the way they
filled up with holding. This is what Moinagda referred to in his article, and also Trinankur worked on it. Filled up with images of hands, the hands floating, climaxing to the hand, lifting the hand of a dead body. So and so.
No, Ananda, you called it ominous, but in Ashwini Shanket, the hand motif finally reaches the climax. Sorry, I'm kind of, taking much of this time. Reaches the climax when the Brahmin Gangacharan actually touches the untouchable Moti.
Yes, that's also a crossing of the boundary.
That's I don't know why you call it ominous, the last bit from that period. But that's where actually what Satyajit Ray meant when he said that it was also the destruction of an order, the caste order. It's strongly hinted at in the novel also. The novel is incomplete. The novel was being serialized in this magazine called Matri Bhumi, I think. It was not completed, but so we don't know exactly what happened to a few characters after that. For example, Chutki. What would happen to Chutki and so on. But it's, this kind of caste question is also kind of foregrounded, as it were, in the novel also. And in the film, it's quite clearly there. So that is the passing of the old order. The order that, that death and destruction and famine and even the partition and all these calamities, predicaments, also around that time or at various stages have helped destroy the kind of foundations of an unjust order. This is the kind of peculiar justice, indirect justice that is meted out by history. Anyway, sorry. Manishita, I had a question because we have to end this session now. So you ask your question, Manishita.
You need to unmute.
So, I have a quick comment. Wonderful paper. I just thought that, that clip you showed us when Opu says, "Ami ar daitto nite parbo na. I can't take responsibility for anyone anymore," which is kind of strange because he has never really taken responsibility for anyone. Maybe briefly for Opu na. And in relation to the famine and how it manifests itself in men and women dying on the streets of Calcutta, and Satyajit Ray's reaction to them as sort of, symbolic of an abject India, the same side generated, radicalized several others of his generation, right? And generated kind of leftist commitment. And I just thought Daitto commitment Daitto can be responsibility, but it can also be Dai or commitment. So I just thought that seems resonant.
Of course. Kind of it resonates. Thank you. Yeah.
Madhuja, can you make it brief? Madhuja?
Yes, yeah.
Please make it brief.
I just wanted to thank you very much, Anindo. I just wanted to add that, I really find your reading of the film as being set in the 40s or late 40s really interesting, and the way the city unfolds, the tram, the places they go, or the sound film that they watch, when they are in the cinema, there are a couple of other instances which makes it quite interestingly clear that there is this sort of a doubling that you are trying to suggest, or you are emphatically saying. I just wanted to add that part.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anindo and all those who kind of participated. Well, the last paper now of the seminar. Let me tell you that Pinaki De, who you didn't find yesterday in the meeting, was watching us on YouTube for some strange reason. So, so I was also wondering where Pinaki disappeared. So thankfully I called up in the morning and reminded him that he has to be here on Google Meet. So he has joined us, and he will be introduced by our colleague, Professor Satyajit Ray.
Thank you, Moinakda. Hi, Pinaki.
Hi, hello.
A long time.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to introduce Pinaki. Dr. Pinaki De is an award-winning graphic illustrator, designer, who works for renowned publishers like Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, Hachette, Routledge, Primus, Oxford University Press, Singapore University Press, Bloomsbury, Orient Black Swan, Worldview, Pan Picasso, Simon & Schuster, Permanent Black, and many others. He has designed almost 500 book covers to date. He is the winner of the Publishing Next Prize for the Best Book Cover Design in India twice in 2017 and 2019. His cover for Calcutta by Kunal Basu won the prestigious Oxford Bookstore Prize for the Best Cover Design in India at Jaipur Literary Fest 2017. His layout design on Satyajit Ray's archival manuscripts has drawn accolades from across the world. A Charles Wallace Trust Fellow, his PhD on comics theory is on comics theory. Pinaki is one of the editors of the annual magazine Long Form, which is published from HarperCollins, which is generally regarded as the first international comics magazine from India. He is the Indian comics advisor of Mangazia, the biggest ever exhibition on Asian comics, curated by Paul Graft for the Barbican, London. Pinaki juggles his creative work with academics, as he has a day job as an associate professor of English in Raja Pyari Mohan College, Uttarpara. Over to you, Pinaki.
Hi, hello. Can I be heard? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. First of all, I must tell you, I'm, mortified. I'm really fearful of doing this, because I really don't know what I'm doing in this kind of assembly of real mavericks. What I want to talk about today is, of course, about Ray's graphic design, something which is curiously not talked about a lot, or even if it is talked about, it is done in almost like a cursory manner, right? So you can find some essays, right, here and there by, of course, Punnendu Potri. You have some essays by Paritosh Sen, K.J. Subramaniam, okay, some by Ujjwal Chakraborty, and of course Debashish Deb and Debashish Mukhopadhyay. But there is no book that really takes on what I call the principles of design and align it with the work of Satyajit Ray. It's very, very surprising, because Ray actually not only designed logos, posters, he illustrated a lot, right? So he almost illustrated, almost like he has almost 4,000 to 5,000 real illustrations, lying across every magazine. Covers, we are trying to archive. I am part of Ray Society, so we are trying to archive the covers done by Satyajit Ray. And it is very surprising to know that, he has done more than around 120, 30 covers, right? Most of them are unknown to us. One of the problems is, of course, sometimes his names are not mentioned, because he used to do it, sometimes, his name is not there, but you can easily understand that this is Ray's work, right? And that's, of course, the case with any other designer during that time. If you look at Punnendu Potri or, say, Khalid Chaudhary, for example, okay, or others. It's the same thing. So what I'll try to do today is, of course, try about something. Try to tell something about Ray's logos. And he has done a lot of logos. Of course, some of them are well known, like the Nandan logo that you can see in the Cineplex in Kolkata, or the Desh logo, the logo of Ajkal, for example, and all those. But there are other logos that he did, for some cultural institutions, for some small magazines, which are not talked about a lot. And even if when you talk about Nandan logo, it's such an interesting story, and it has got such a backstory, which almost goes back to Ray's days at Shantiniketan, that a lot of people actually miss. So what I'm trying to say, of course, I'll talk about Gestalt. And when I talk about Gestalt, of course, I'll be talking about certain things which are, of course, Gestalt is, of course, something which is related to psychology, but it's, of course, applied across the visual spectrum. So there will be some kind of formal theorization, and not, in a very understandable way, because Ray, in a way, is trying to apply all the principles of Gestalts in very interesting ways. Now, many people ask me, why are you forcing this idea of Gestalt on Ray's design? Because Ray never mentioned the idea of Gestalt anywhere. Ray didn't talk about, of course, even his contemporaries never talk about Gestalt too much. But of course, it's a bit of a speculation. But if you look at the archives in detailed manner, say if you look at the DJ Kimur archives, which of course later became Clarion, where I also worked for a bit of time, 1 year, you can see that there were magazines that came, and of course, Ray's colleagues there, like O.C. Ganguly, who are actually championing this idea of, the Gestalt, or, sometimes, one of the movements that use Gestalt, the Bauhaus movement, right? In fact, the Bauhaus had an exhibition in Calcutta, and we forget that in 1922, it's called Bauhaus in Calcutta. And of course, Tapati Gothakuda, of course, has written a wonderful kind of reconstructed that entire exhibition in a very interesting way. Now, the main problem, of course, is that the exhibition, we really don't know what was there. We know some of Klee paintings were there, Paul Klee's painting were there. And of course, it's basically the brainchild of Stella Cambrish, who was, of course, teaching in Shantiniketan during that time. And she was instrumental in bringing that exhibition to Kolkata. And, you have Shunayani Devi, a little known artist, and also Gaganendranath and Abanindranath. They're all participating along with Keel and Kandinsky and other people. Okay, so there are hints that Ray was basically, somehow, they knew about Gestalt. And if you look at certain small areas in these conversations, again, which are like not directly documented, conversations in Shantiniketan with his friends like Prithvish Niyogi and Dinkar Kaushik. Dinkar Kaushik writes about all these foreign movements for considerable length, and you can understand that Ray actually forged a very close friendship with Dinkar Kaushik. So again, it's a kind of a speculative leap that I'm taking. But the one thing that I have actually discovered, and this is something that I've discovered from Ray's house, that he was a regular subscriber of a magazine called Gebrosh Graphic. Again, a magazine which is not available now. I have some of the scans of the magazines, at least the cover of the magazines, which will show that, and he was like a lifelong subscriber till it, of course, was dismantled, right? So what I'm trying to see is, and there are markings in the magazines. I wish I could show you the markings where Ray is actually, trying to make certain points. I will also today try to show you some of the literary notebooks of Ray. Again, a lot of things is not being seen. So what you know is Kheror Khata, but many people don't know that there are almost like many, I'm not going to say the number, but many literary notebooks of Ray, and they're full of materials which I can say, if it is published, and it will be published, will open up a completely new dimension of Ray, because that's, I think, very crucial in the way we appraise Ray today. So before, this is the discussion. Due to, of course, I've taken permission from Sandeep Ray, and of course, this is purely for this seminar. But and so these are small disclaimers I want to talk about. And it's a very small paper. It's not even a paper. It's like a presentation, because whenever graphic designers speak, and here I'm taking on that mantle more than being an academic, you try to show things, right? The very idea of showing things visually. And I want to talk about certain visual motives and certain visual, ideas that Ray is trying to juggle with. Okay, so studies on Gestalt psychology was made just before the First World War in Frankfurt Psychological Institute. We all know that. And there were scientists who spearheaded it: Wolfgang Kohler, Max Wertheimer, and Kurt Kafka. And of course, one of the most important books is Kafka's Principles of Gestalt Psychology. The essential ideology, of course, can be summed up in a statement by Kafka. And this is a very important statement. The whole is actually other than the sum of the parts. So normally we try to define it a bit, with a bit of a fallacy. We normally tell the whole is greater than the part. That was not the definition. The whole is different from the part, or the whole is the other of the part. That's exactly the word used. The other was the word that is used by Kafka. The relationship links both physically and logically between the parts is significant and gives an additional value to the whole, which is not present in the parts themselves if it is simply summed up. The aspect of Gestalt theory that interests designers, of course, are related to the theory's postulation of visual perception, principally the relationship between the parts and the whole of visual experience. I will explain that later. In simplest term, of course, Gestalt theory is based on the idea that human brain will attempt to amplify and organize complex images or designs that consist of many elements by subconsciously arranging the parts into an organized system that creates the whole, rather than just a series of disparate elements. Now, the very idea of Gestalt, as you can easily understand, is kind of a reaction to the disorder that you see in the First World War. Is the very idea of order, the idea of system that's being regularly spelled out, and that need for order is also something that Ray is almost demanding, which is a bit curious if you know the history of design in India, because Ray is almost imposing that idea of order while he's designing, and I'll talk about that later. So in Gestalt, of course, the Gestalt psychology tells that our brains are naturally wired to see structure and patterns in order to understand better the environment that we live in. Of course, Gestalt theories are expressed in laws, and these are a bit archaic today, if you know, because, of course, with the advent of computer and all that, Gestalt has actually taken a huge leap. Cognition has taken a huge leap, and it's very difficult to talk about that here. But that archaism fits our structure very well, because during Ray's time, that idea was not valid. So Ray was probably acquainted with that very classical kind of Gestalt, rather than the kind of, theoretical advances that has completely taken over Gestalt now. So, for example, there is a book which I really like called by Boring, which is called Sensation and Perception in the History of Experimental Psychology. There's a very interesting quote. In 1933, Harry Helson, American psychologist, actually extracted 114 laws. Look at the insistence on the new number, of course, very structural. But anyway, 114 laws of Gestalt. All but half a dozen of this law is applicable to visual form. So, of course, Gestalt is a gamut of laws. There's only some which are taken, for reference with visuality, with reference to visuality. Now, if you look at the traditional nature of the Gestalt laws, they are used to suggest how static visual elements to be presented in order to achieve what I call affective visual results. The application of Gestalt psychology is particularly effective in logo design, where a simple piece of lettering or shape is playfully turned into a visual iconography with a language of its own. After all, good logos create an effective information architecture that informs the ideology of a logo. Now, before I go into Ray's logo, let me just talk about basic principles of Gestalt, very basic principles, and we can actually see how Ray is manipulating those principles in order to create his own logos. I I hope I can present this. Okay.
Yeah, you see the.
Yeah, I can
now. Oh, okay.
Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yes.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, wonderful. So one of the basic things that you see in Gestalt is, of course, the idea, the principle of Gestalt is the idea of emergence. So I have, you can see, written emergence with small ants that are crawling in. So here, of course, the whole is identified before the parts. So you don't look at the parts first. You actually just look at the whole, because if you just go beyond, you can probably read the word emergence. And when you actually go a bit closer, you can see the ants crawling in. Then, of course, you have the very idea of reification, which is like used by Rave a lot of times. And reification is basically where it's based on the idea of closure in design. And it's, of course, the very idea of negative space and the way it closes down. And you can see how our mind actually fills in the gap. So if you look at the upper example, you can see that the triangle is not actually drawn. Sorry, the triangle is not drawn, but you can make out the triangle because your mind is visually trying to, create that idea of the triangle, because that's the way reification works. Of course, another interesting principle of Gestalt used in visual psychology, in visual arts, is, of course, the idea of multistability. And of course, in multistability, the mind actually tries to, avoid uncertainty, because you try to talk about ambiguous perception, where you try to go back and forth in order to avoid what I called alternative interpretations. You can have many interpretations of the same thing. So the best example is, of course, the Necker cube, where, no visual cues is given to the orientation. So you can see it can be the front or it can be the back. The Necker cube is, of course, very interesting visual optical illusion. Another very interesting optical illusion is, of course, created by Edgar Rubin, the Danish psychologist. That's a Rubin face, again, very well known. These are basically ideas of multistability that's related to Gestalt. Another very interesting and directly related to that idea of multistability is the very idea of figure ground separation. Now, this is very, very important in design, and I have done a very simple exercise, but you can see how I can actually separate things by means of accentuation. And I'll show you, because one of the things that we designers do is to play around with shapes, right? Space, and also with layers, and also with, figures. But, one of the very important thing that we do is, of course, talk about angularity and how you manage that angularity in a certain way, how you sort of compress the angularity, how you try to manipulate or recreate the angularity into figures and shapes, which are normally not seen, at the first glance. So, the figure is, of course, something that is there, and the ground is, of course, the negative space, the space on which you actually try to create that accentuation. So you can see that, if you go from A, B, C, D to I, you can see that you can actually read it both ways. You can read it from L to A, or you can read it from A to L. And you can see the basic principle is the very idea of separation and a kind of a diagonal separation, and how that diagonal separation or a zigzag separation can create the very idea of Rubik, of the Rubin vase. So again, I'm not explaining this too much, because these are basically practice-based things, although, there is a kind of a theoretical reference to it, but these are mostly related to practice rather than anything else. Another very interesting thing of Gestalt related to visuality, visual perception, is the idea of invariance. And of course, in invariance, it's very easy. You can recognize similarities and differences in geometrical objects, independent of, say, rotation, translation, scale, or even, any kind of elastic deformation. So this, hold, rectangular object, whatever way you look at, if you actually play up the perspective in a certain way, it doesn't lose its identity of what it is already. So again, a very common thing that is used in logo, because whenever we do a 3D logo, this is actually what we play on, the very idea of invariance. Another very interesting thing that's of course very Bauhaus also, because that's of course prognance. And if you look at prognance, it's a very simple thing. It's actually a German word for pithiness. There is a very simple thing, good figure and, law of simplicity. So we actually draw a figure and, try to talk about that figure in the simplest of terms. So basically, this law of prognance, always reduces everything to the most stable and the simplest form. So if you see this amorphousness in an abstract object, you can actually reduce it to a triangle, square, and a circle. So this is again a very common thing by which you try to geometrically separate a visual object in order to, curve out certain ideas from where you can playfully, talk about the ideology that the logos may actually try to talk about, project. Okay, what is very interesting, Kafka actually says that people will always perceive and interpret ambiguous or complex images as the simplest form possible, although I don't agree with it always, but this is what Kafka says. So, we'll just, since we are talking about, of course, Gestalt, we will stick to these classical ideas. So I'm not going on what can be the other implication of these ideas. So when you write, say, Gestalt, the entire word, you can see the law of prognance can actually be based on proximity. So if you can see the G, the word G, with the small squares, they are together because they are, close together, proximity. You can have common fate. So, the what I call the horizontal lines, for example, are, IBM logo, for example. If you look at IBM logo, it's a very classical idea, a classic case of what I call the idea of common fate, where, the IBM, the stripes actually run together and, it sort of integrates within the entire IBM. It nestles within the word IBM. There's also the very idea of continuity, where the S, the swish of the S can actually, Coca-Cola, for example, one logo, the C, if you look at the way the C and the C, the Coca and the C of Coca and the C of Cola actually uses that principle of continuity in order to create a very simple, very simple symbol. Okay, there's also the very idea of similarity. So you can see there are dots everywhere, but since the T is only defined by the darker dots, so it is only the similar which can create this very idea. So all these things are seen, used in logo. Also, there is the idea of closure, for example, which is very close to reification. And you can see the A is actually closed. There is the A, one of the parts of A is not missing, but you can close it, by perceptually close it. One of the best example is, of course, the WWF, the World Wild Wide Fund logo, the panda, which is never ever drawn full. It's only the shadow of the of one part of the panda that is drawn. It's not even completed. The outline of the panda is always missing. Then you have the common region and symmetry. Now, why I'm trying to tell all these, one of the problems, of course, which we see now today, but one of the things that Gestalt championed during that time is that very idea of balance. And it took that idea of balance to almost preposterous levels. Sometimes the very idea of order is being taken to such levels that you almost try to geometrically balance things out. So a lot of logos that were done during that time, almost fell into the trap that Bauhaus, set together. It's a very attractive principle during that time. You can easily understand that because it is something that people were almost, they love it, they love the balance. So whenever there is a bit of imbalance or something that juts out, something that projects out, that's something out of the, of the matrix of the balance, people got a bit, they termed it as bad design, of course. Now this is what you can see. So this is something that we do. This is one of my sheets that when I do a logo, this is one of the sheets that I normally practice. So I actually try to talk about continuity, containment, closure, grouping, repetition, proximity, and I do these style sheets all over again. So one of my job as a designer is to invent these sheets more and more. So whenever a logo comes, I actually play with the shapes in a very, very interesting manner. So that's almost like going into the psyche of the designer and the practice sheets, which today, are built on the basic principles of Gestalt. Now, what about Ray? Now, whenever we talk about Ray, remember, I talked about, whether Ray actually knew about Gestalt. He, of course, definitely knew about it. And one of the sources of Gestalt and one of the magazines that, almost champion Gestalt is a magazine that Ray actually subscribed. And it's a magazine called Gebrosh Graphic. Of course, it used to come in DJ Kima. It was one of the subscribed magazines in DJ Kima, very popular among advertising circles in 1950s. And, it is something that Ray also began to take, at home as well. So you have a home. So it's 1950s and 60s. It's of course it of course discontinued after late 1960s, 70s, early 70s. But till then, Ray used to, subscribe to this magazine a lot. And if you can see, of course, these are all built on Bohos ideas of, shapes, angularity, geometrical shapes, angularity, and the way, these shapes actually try to stack together in a kind of an orderly fashion. But this is also something that you can see the other magazine covers, and it gives you a very simple idea of what Gebrush Graphic is all about. So if you look at the inside, of course, it is almost the same. But from this very, covers, and I've given you a lot of covers here, you can easily see the kind of scientific order that, Gestalt tries to bring in the whole ideas of advertising design and design in general. Now, another studio that is, of course, very influential in the 90s, in 1960s and 50s, in the graphic art scenario of the in the advertising scenario of Kolkata is the Pushpin studio. So if you look at the Pushpin studio's work also, it, in a way is obsessed with this idea of Gestalt, with this idea of negative space playing out, okay, and stacking together in order to form a kind of a different perceptive reality. So these may be some of the influences. But if you go to the logos, I think before we go to the logos, let us look one of the paintings by Satyajit Ray, illustrations rather by Satyajit Ray. And this is, of course, Barin Bhumikar Baram. And if you look at Barin Bhumikar Baram's original artwork, this is not the original artwork, this is, of course, scanned from the magazine, you can see how these principles of, the geometrical, the structures that almost inform one hand that separates it from the other hand, which is the white space that defines the other hand from where you can see Barin Bhumik's eyes popping up. These are, of course, done by something that, Ray took help of. It's called Letraset or Letraset. It used to be brought from UK, and, Letraset created these kind of very interesting geometrical patterns, and these geometrical patterns are almost stenciled onto the drawing. So he will be drawing certain things, he may not be drawing anything, he may not be drawing any outline at all, he will just stencil everything, by making a kind of what I call a kind of a complex collage. So you'd actually put paper, and you will bring the paper, on the paper you would stencil things, and and the gap that arose out of the paper will be, say, the white space that will define a figure. For example, the white hand here, will not be drawn. What we'll do is, of course, we will fill up the details around the white hand, so the white hand actually comes out. Okay, and this is there in other parts of, other illustrations of Barin Bhumikar Baram, and you can easily see the same principle. And this, of course, these are paper cuttings, which are simple paper cuttings which are used. All the illustrations of Barin Bhumikar Baram somehow, is almost similar, and of course, which is natural. But what is very interesting that he never applies this illustrative, technique ever later. I mean, I haven't noticed any other works except maybe one advertisement where he actually used this idea later. Again, another from Barin Bhumikar Baram. And you can see the waviness of the hair, is of course very important, because that is where the baram is, the baram is of course in the head. So, the waviness of the hair and, the way the mouth is of course effaced or erased, very minimal in the way he actually draws things, and everything is actually, you can see the entire figure brought out by the paper cut silhouette at the back. Okay. Of course, if you look at typography, and I cannot discuss it in detail here because it will be a bit technical. If you look at typography 1926-30s, of which he was definitely aware of. If you look at universal typeface, for example, I've actually taken it from Joseph Albers, one of the pioneers of Bauhaus typography. Or if you look at Herbert Baer, another important here, you can see the way the sans serif typeface actually uses the Gestalt principle in order to minimize what I call the embellishment related to typography. So if you look at other serif typeface which are extremely embellished, decorated, or if you look at the Old English typeface and the other typeface that the manuscripts have, you can see how this is being shorn of all those. One is to achieve industrial perfection. That's one of the reasons. But also another thing is, of course, to create this idea of what I call utilitarianism. Type is there, and it is utilitarian to use type in a very simple way. So if you look at Baer's typography, this is the proof sheet of the universal alphabet. You can see how the angularity of the shapes actually create a kind of a minimum. So if you have a D, for example, if you have a B, and a D are exactly just flipped, they are just flipped from each other. So if you can look at C and the E, you can actually create a very simple circle. Or if you can, the very idea of a vertical line and a circle defines every letter in this, proof sheet. So for example, an X is like that. Later, when Satyajit Roy will actually do the Eisenstein Cine Club photo, logo, he will actually use this principle in a very, very interesting way. I'll show that later as well. So let us look at Ray's typography. Again, if you look at Ray's typography, I'm not going to the anatomy of type, but if you look at Ray's typography, he created for typography. And again, very surprising, nobody talks about Ray's typography. He was almost a self-taught typographer, and he used to do typography through graph sheets, which is normally not the way a typography should be developed. He did it during 1960s. I've asked many people about the timeline of these typographies, but never found any answer, any evidence of the exact date when he did it. He was, of course, commissioned by a foundry in US that we know. Again, we really don't know who commissioned him. Of course, there are 4 typography, type fonts that he created: Ray Roman, Bizarre, Daphnis, and Holiday Script. Out of which it is very interesting to see Ray Roman. And if you look at Ray Roman, and if you actually look at Ray Roman, you can see, Ray is actually using this very idea of, the simplest shapes in order to create. So, for example, a P and a Q are just flipped versions of one another, or say a C or a E, so what you try to do is basically, the very derivation of the typeface. If you look at the accender or the descender and, the body of the typeface, you can easily understand that everything actually is based on the basic geometrical principles of of a vertical line that almost holds together these that holds together this idea of small circles or semicircles that may define one alphabet or the other. Now let us come to the logo, because that is where I am very interested at and where I'm trying to analyze a bit. Now this is of course not exactly a logo, but these are the kind of works that you can see Ray doing a lot. This is of course not very common. This is of course taken from Shomik Bandyopadhyay, who had it. This is actually a World Conference of Peace and International Cooperation folder. And in this folder, there was a poem by Subhash Mukhopadhyay, which was written to commemorate Nehru's death in 1964. And Ray, while designing it, also pays tribute to Nehru by combining the red rose with, of course, the Dawn of Peace. So you can see the you can see the pigeon and of course the red rose. So the whorl of the rose and of course the core of the rose nestles the pigeon. Now this is of course not very complicated, very simple, but these are the kind of kind of pictograms, if I'm allowed to say, or something, or icons that Ray is doing frequently. If you look at the small letterings that he does, of course he does it in posters which are much more complicated, where there is no scope to discuss those, but these are the kind of pictograms that you can also see in the headpieces that is done for Sandesh, for example. A lot of headpieces that he does, for example the Khogom headpiece, there are many headpieces where he actually creates these pictograms through letters. This playfulness with the alphabet itself, with the core idea of language itself, the core blocks of language is something that Ray almost revels it. If you see Ray's literary notebook, it is actually full of riddles, and the way Bengali alphabets can be written, in various ways, and that's what he actually puts to use when he does the logo. So the next one that you actually can see is, of course, the very interesting thing of Nandikar logo. It's a very common logo. But if you look at the Nandikar logo, he uses the idea of reification a lot, because a lot of things here are unsaid. And I don't know whether it's my imagination, but, the entire Nandikar word can be read, if you actually look at the logo very, closely. Now, first of all, the border of the logo is very, very important, because without the border, the logo doesn't happen. And I'll tell you why. Many people have said that this is only probably no. Okay, you have just taken the letter, the alphabet no, and you have actually created a mask, right? So you have created a mask which curiously looks like an African mask. So this is the way this is done. So this is a mask, and look at the way a border is there. It almost nestles the mask. One of the very interesting thing, everything is closed, but there is an open end, and the open end is of course the part which is of course the profile of the mask. Okay, it's probably the nose of the mask which is open. But if you look at this logo, you can see the word Nandikar actually is done, but you have to assume how it is written. So no, this is no, this is a, because of course a is part of the nose part. So na, remember there is Nandika, Jontennoy doi, so there are adjunct. So what you have to do is this do is done in a very, very interesting way. So Jontenno and do is actually just placed side by side. So if you look at do, it is this shape. What it does, it just inverts this shape in a very, very interesting way to create a kind of a rotated do. So you have Nandikar, Jontennoy akar, and then Jontenno, and this becomes a do, in a very interesting way, Nandikar. So again, look at this, ko, and there is of course nothing here, but Nandikar, a, and Jontenno dirgho is of course this, it may be, and raw. So what is very interesting is that maybe I'm imagining a bit more than necessary, but what is very interesting is that the entire idea of Nandikar, of course the very balance of the lettering, if you look at the way the verticality of it is actually balanced, so if you can look at the way the balance is achieved, the Jontenno, and this very curious shape, the mouth shape below, the way the balance is achieved, almost like a binary, that the Jontenno and the are actually playing off each other in a very complex way. Of course, the Jontenno is the only thing that is visible. The other things are almost invisible. Other things are what you assume or you may not assume. And I'm not blaming you. If you only think it is an N, I don't care. But I think Ray didn't care as well. But what is very interesting, that within the idea of Nandika, the entire letter set or the entire alphabets were tried to be fit in, but not through a direct evocation, but through the idea of reification, where a lot of things has to be assumed, or it is something that is left to assumption. Now, this is a very old logo. This is a kind of a logo that he did earlier. And if you look at the Rupa logo, many people have actually asked me that if today's Rupa logo is by Ray, it's not by Ray. So the Rupa logo that he did was, of course, the Bengali logo, and he also wrote the English logo. But this is, of course, a kind of a gift wrap of the Rupa logo. And if you can see the idea of reification here. And of course, if you remember of Escher, for example, the way, the square is formed. So if you can see, this is very, very interesting. So if you can look at the logo, of course, look at the way the word Rupa is written. Remember, Rupa, Dirgho is a complicated word to accommodate. So you actually accommodate raw, but look at this raw. Can you see? This is a kind of a square raw, which is actually balanced by the akar matra. So the raw and the akar matra are almost reflective of each other, whereas the dirghukar and the pa of pa, akar of pa is actually balanced. So those who don't know Bengali, it will be a bit difficult, but if you know Bengali, it is notoriously difficult, it's a very soft letter kind of a thing, so whenever you try to write Rupa, for example, the very idea is to, go back to the idea of calligraphy or to write it by longhand. And if you look at Bengali longhand, it's much more smoother, it's much more softer, the contours are much more what I call variegated, which are much more, dependent on the way your hand moves. But here, Ray actually creates a kind of a geometry out of nowhere. So I personally feel it's a very, very interesting logo. If you look at the Rupa logo and look at the balance, if you look at this entire diagonal balance of the logo, you will see how he was obsessed with the idea of geometrical perfection. And if you look at Ray's notebook, and I will show you one example later at the end of the piece, you can see how he's trying to fit in things within geometrical shapes. It's almost like to force fit things into a kind of geometricality. This of course arises a lot of problems regarding the very idea of order in graphic design, or whether it should be taken to that kind of length as Ray did, or other practitioners did during that time. But this is what he very interestingly did. So if you look at this playful nature of words with Ray, one of the things that I want to show is the signature of Ray, and how playful he is with the signature. So if you look at this and look at the way he is experimented with many kind of styles. So you have Chinese style, you have Japanese style, you have Indian old, you can have kind of a very Chitta Prasad like, print, Bengal print style. You have a Katha stitch style. Every kind of style he experimented with. So, that's something that he did. But look at this. So this is of course blown up. This is studied brilliantly by Devashish Deb in his book called Rangatuli Satyajit. But what is very interesting is the kind of signature, the kind of playfulness that he attached. So look at the shaw here, or say the very, look at the Chinese, the Japanese kind, and look at this, the block kind of Satyajit. So this playfulness with the Bengali alphabets is something that we will look at in the later logo. So let us look at, say, the Indira logo. Here, of course, there is a lot of concentric circles, and unlike, say, Rupa, this is not too angular. But even if it is not angular, the sense of symmetry that is there. So, for example, if you look at the way, it's like a fish. So you can see it's like a fish. Indira is, of course, the name of a school that taught music, and he did the logo for that. And if you can see, look at the way, of course, this may mean sound and all that. I really don't know why the fish came into being. But the very interesting thing is, again, the balance that he achieves, the very balance that he achieves, and the kind of almost this obsession with symmetry. One of the things that I always noticed about Ray, that he's a very hard-lined painter. Now, of course, hard-lined in a very interesting way, because he always uses hard lines So if you really see his paintings, or whenever he painted, whenever he applied, say for example, things like oil or maybe some watercolors, he was not so comfortable. You can easily make out from that. So if you look at the Rabindranath commemorative calendar that he did, which is actually full of paintings, depicting episodes of, Tagore's lives, you can see it's a brilliant calendar, but you can see that problems that he faced with the painting seeping out of the lines. So whenever everything stays within the line, within the hard edges of the line, within the hard demarcated lines, everything is perfect. But whenever things seeps out of it, he is he feels a bit uncomfortable, or he doesn't do too much to justify that he's comfortable in that. One of the best logos that I've seen is, of course, for the first sci-fi magazine in Bengal, which is, of course, fantastic. Of course, it's a landmark in terms of, but what about the logo? And this is a brilliant idea of reification. So, of course, if you look at fantastic, fan, Pojafalaka Jontenno, to, tastic, Jonteshoy, toy, ko. Now, who can assume that these jofalas, can you see the jofalas are not actually written? Again, very reified, it's almost, you can have to wear it in your brain. You have to close it down on the brain. So the jofala is actually again balanced by the two, toe. So you can see the swish of the toe, the length of the toes, two toe actually balances the two jofala. And this is very, very interesting. And if you can also make out the spindle shape of a UFO, or an unidentified flying object. So it's very, very interesting case study. And it's not a very known logo that people associated with Ray. Of course, it was done very early, but you can easily understand how this plays out in a very, very interesting role. But the logo that I want to concentrate is, of course, the Nandan logo, and of course, the Eisenstein Cine Club logo. Now, this was done much, much earlier. So if you look at the Eisenstein Cine Club logo, it actually uses circles. And if you look at the circles, it's a very, very simple form. So you can easily understand the E is broken up. So Eisenstein's E is broken up into two circles, semicircles rather, and it is surrounded by two C. So Cine Club. So you have two C. Of course, one C is half, another is almost full. Of course, the circular or semicircular shape has an affective principle. And of course, it exudes the idea related to integration, unity, wholeness, and completion. Remember, it's a club. It's a cine club. It's, of course, the meeting ground of like-minded people. So this very idea of cohesion, the very idea of being in a circle, of encirclement, is something that being talked about. Now, that's easy enough. But what is very interesting is the way he actually creates a kind of a geometrical, balance in the way, the E and the two C's are balanced. Okay. Now, this idea may be derived from a lot of things that you may have seen in Shantiniketan. So, for example, this logo, the Nandan seal, remember, this is the seal of Nandan. And this is discussed, by one of the designers of Shantiniketan, Shubho. But I have something more to add. So this is very interesting. So Nandan seal is done by Nandalal Bose. So this is basically the seal designed in 1930s by Nandalal Bosu for Nandan. Remember, in Shantiniketan. And if you look at it, it's very interesting. Both are, then this is, of course, done much, much later, late 70s, early 80s by Satyajit Roy. And this is something, it's a very familiar logo, the Nandan logo that you see in the Cineplex in Kolkata. Now, of course, the very interesting thing is these are divided into three, what I call latitudinal tiers. Here, of course, the division is not seen, but it's almost invisibly divided into three latitudinal tiers. And then each of them, each tier negotiates space according to its own spatial demand. Of course, Satyajit's spatial orientation is much more complex, which is at once both latitudinal and longitudinal. So whereas Nandalal closes up the latitudinal axis, encloses the latitudinal axis, Satyajit actually let this, longitudinal axis play along with the latitudinal axis, creating a sense of tension. And I'll tell you how. So if you look at this word Nandon, it is a palindrome, right? So if you actually spell it from here, and if you go it from here, it's the same. So the conjunct, which is Jontennoi Doi, is the thing that holds the whole thing together. In, of course, Nandalal's logo, if you have Jontennoi Doi in the middle, and look at the way the Jontenno and the Jontenno are almost balancing each other. So if you can actually draw an invisible line, you can see there are 3 longitudinal planes through which the Nandon logo actually works. But what Nandalal does is, of course, he also builds this latitudinal axis and accentuates them. He actually tries to accentuate them. So you can easily understand the whole logo becomes a bit compartmentalized. Although remember, it's a seal, but we can count it as a logo. But here, what Satyajit does is an act of genius. You can see he actually uses a extra material, a vine-shaped, kind of finery to the word Nandon. So if you can see Jontenno, Jontennoi Doi, Jontenno. Now, why he is using this? Now, this is very, very interesting. The text is, of course, vertically arranged. So the flow of I would be usually from top to down. So normally you read Jontenno, Jontennoi Doi, Jontenno, from top to down. But remember, it's a palindrome. So this vine is actually going upwards. So, Satyajit is probably consciously drawing your attention to the way that it can be also, read from the opposite direction. So you can actually read Jontenno, Jontennoi Doi, Jontenno. And it is the vine that creates that tension, which actually, almost. So this idea, this penchant for wordplay, riddles, is something that Satyajit does. So, this directional tension that appears within the logo of Nandon is almost like a stroke of a genius, right? And it goes back to this idea of Nandalal's drawing. And if you actually take this a bit further, if you look at Ekkhon, for example, the same principles at work. So if you look at Ekkhon, koi koi, so kyo. So if you look at it, and this is mudhanna. So how many circles are there? So you have 1 circle, you have 2 half circles, 3, 4. So you have 4. So here you have 2. So you have 2, 4, and you have 1. So you have 2 plus 4 plus 1. So Satyajit can actually play with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 circles. Of course, I'm sorry, and there are 3 here, so 6. Sorry. So 2 plus 3 plus 1 is 6. So again, and that can be divided into vertical line, because Ekkhon, for example, if you look at it, look, there is verticality in Jontenno, this and this. So you have 3 vertical lines, and you can actually play with 6 circles with the words, with the letters. And if you look at all the Ekkhon covers, they actually use and manipulate those circle and a strong verticality. So sometimes a single vertical axis is used instead of 3. Or say, look at the way. So this actually reminds you, every Ekkhon cover, I think, is a tribute to one of the art movements, either in India, either in the East or the West. So you can see a William Morris wallpaper here, almost there. You can see the very Alpona style, and almost used a kind of a symmetrical layout. And you can also see constructivism, for example, the way Ekkhon is broken up. So here I think this is much more easier to understand. So look at the way he has broken up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And very interestingly, instead of the circle, he can actually use a and then use this 3, that's triangles. So again, he can minimize it to, much bare forms. So if you look at the Ekkhon cover, and sometimes whenever the Ekkhon covers works, and so look at the way the vertical axis almost nestles, almost forms the spine of these circles or semicircles that are almost taken together. So if you look at, the concentric circles, that of course reminds you of, old classics. Say, for example, look at this Alpona kind of a figure of Ekkhon. This is very, very interesting. Here, of course, the verticality is not even referred to. but you have to imagine, so this is almost like this idea of the gestalt, where you actually imagine the axis and look at the no, for example, and the kyoma. So, one axis can actually get you a, khoi, koi, khoi, and mudhanna, kyo and mudhanna. So basically this is very interesting. The same thing happens in Anandamala, the first logo that he did for Anandamala, which is now discontinued, of course, unfortunately. This, of course, reminds you of one of the covers that he did for Sudhindranath Datta, Pratidhwani. And Pratidhwani, of course, these are bars, sound bars, whatever you call it. But look at the way the vertical, the verticality, the vertical axis. So, for example, when you have a con, so as I've told you, this vertical axis, are something that you have to play with. So you can actually play with it, you don't have to do 3. You can actually reduce it to 1. So these are the small plays that you do it. Similarly, in Desh, so if you go to the Desh logo, it uses a kind of a block-like dimension along with a very interesting symmetry. Now, if you look at the Desh logo, can you see this part of the logo? I hope you can see this. I'm marking it in red. So if you see this part of the logo, which is almost like Jontenno, and if you look at this part of the logo, which is again like Jontenno, can you see? They're almost reflection of each other. So they are almost reflection of each other. So, this is very, very interesting. Again, you have 3 circles, which forms the basis, and, instead of a small letter, so instead of, the vertical, many vertical axis, you have a kind of a block door which holds everything together. But again, this very idea of assiduously maintaining the symmetry, at least in his mind, so that, expecting the readers to discover the similarity, or at least, cognitively, so that the similarity plays out in one way or the other, is something that he's striving for. One of the coup of his design is, of course, the Sundaram logo. Of course, Sundaram is a very important art magazine, and it was run by Shubho Thakur. We all know that. And Sundaram has a very, very interesting template. Now, if you look at the Sundaram logo, and this is very, very interesting, it almost becomes a logo because it is used across every part of the magazine. And now this is a very difficult thing to do. So you are actually got triangles, all of them of the similar, height, length, everything is similar. So when you write Sundaram, you know how difficult it is to geometrically convert it. One of the problem is, of course, Jontesha and Jontennoy Doi. Ro is, of course, easy. Even more, I think, is easy. If you can actually make out Jontesha even. But what about Jontennoy Doi? And it requires a kind of, a very complex derivative. And I can actually show it later, how he almost arrives at that Jontennoy Doi with a kind of a space. But if you look at this logo, it almost looks like a shadow. It is as if that spine of the letter, that's the black spine of the letter, almost shades what I call, casts elongated shadows. It's as if, and these are almost reification by color, because it is the color which distinguishes, because otherwise you can actually don't see the outline of the shape. So Sundaram, the shape is only manifest through the idea of colors without any outline. So these are the way, and look at the way his sense of balance again almost overplays itself. So Jontennoy, look at this. So there is a parity everywhere. Of course, you cannot write the same thing because all of these means differently. Sundaram, R is only a dot. More, you can make sense. But look, so Jontesha is a kind of a flipped, this Jontesha is, the ending of Jontesha, and Jontennoy Doi and Mo is almost similar. So, but there is a kind of a visual parity. You can see that there is a kind of a continuance of the way this entire logo plays out. Now, before I end, and I'm sorry, I'm taking a lot of times, a lot of things, maybe my own imaginings, and because I probably overthink over designs, and I don't know whether Ray used to do this, is of course the development from, this is from his Keror, this is from his literary notebook, and this is about the Peters fan. Remember Peter's fan? This is from Shimabadho, and you have a logo there. Unfortunately, there was a kind of a sequential reference to the animation film, which he tried to do, which he failed, and that is not available anymore. There is a kind of a small reference of an animation film that he wanted to do with Ram Kumar, the doyen of Indian animation, in Shatranj Ke Khiladi, which is again lost. But if you look at the Peter's fan logo, if you look at the initial idea, he wanted to actually make the word P very important, because of course it's natural, because P contains the fan, the fan-like, the whole whirl, the concentric, the movement of a concentric circle, which the trajectory of a fan may define. But later on, look at the way he is actually moving towards a very different direction. And he's again falling back. If you look at Peters, he's actually falling back into a kind of balance with E, T, and C. So if you look at T, it is a very balanced thing. And if you look at E, and so he's actually, making this the basic idea. So if you can see that these are many ideas that he actually wanted to talk about, wanted to do, he tried out. And later, when he's actually coming to the final logo, Hindustan Peters, or later Peters fan, you can see he actually plays up this later. Later, when it is seen in the film, of course, it's a hollowed out, font, very interesting, kind of tubular font. And again, look at the way this part almost, achieves a sense of parity, and the way this symmetry of the T, extends into two E's, the way it plays out. This is, of course, the Peters logo. If you actually go to his literary notebook, you can actually feel all these things, almost. This is, of course, Bagro Devata, which never happened. But, even before he thought about the entire idea, you can see the way he is actually trying to play with the figure of the tiger and the lettering. And if you look at the doodles, and there are many, of course, you can easily understand. I don't have much more to show today, but there are doodles which shows that he's almost doing 5-6 pages of pure lettering, and it's almost manipulating, it's almost playing it with a kind of a riddle, like a riddle. It's almost like playing with it. He's almost shifting things here and there in order to create figures, in order to bring out figures. But whenever he does it, the one of the things that I find a bit problematic, and look, I'm a huge fan of Ray, but one of the things that I find a bit problematic is that he's almost too much obsessed with the balance, with the idea of geometrical balance. In fact, if you look at the Gantoke Gondogol cover, if you can see that, you can see the Fibonacci actually playing out. Ujjwal has a very interesting essay. If you go to, say, the set design of Gupigain Bagabain, you can actually find a lot of mathematical principles playing out even in the set designs. So this is it. I don't know whether I have actually made sense at all. I really don't know. This is purely from a designer's point of view, and of course there are ideological implications of all these, because if you actually compare the art movements during that time and the way Ray and of course his ilk. So if you look at, say, Prunobesh Maiti, for example, one of probably the doyens, the best collector of all the covers that I've seen, at least in India here, nobody collects like Prunobesh Da. But his style, or if you look at Khalid Chaudhury's style, they're radically different. And if you actually look at the history of printmaking, and if you can look at the work of Chitta Prasad and Jainul Abidin, so they actually belong to a completely different kind of gharana, if I'm allowed to tell like that. But what is very curious in Ray, and this is even after Ray's education in Shantiniketan, is his almost his obsession to force fit certain geometrical patterns. So he actually took a lot of Alpona motifs from Shantiniketan, so because these were almost geometrical in nature, to certain angularity which is there in the Western arts. So this hardness, the hard angularity that you have in Western arts is almost tried to be almost interpolated with certain ideas that he actually took up from Nandolal or Vinod Bihari and the other people that especially, and if you look at his life at Shantiniketan, we don't know a lot, But we know that he was very close to Dinkar Kaushik. And if you look at Dinkar Kaushik's, work, essays on art, you can see how they are trying to almost fit in categories. It's as if, you need to somehow create, there is this urge to create that fusion and, in a very conscious manner. Okay, say unlike a Ramkinkar, who was much more into a completely different trajectory, although he is, of course, modern in his own way. But what is very interesting, if you look at what he is actually getting from Shantiniketan, that's also a question that I ask myself. And I can see a lot of his works, which are studies of Ajanta Ellora paintings, which are basically case studies. Remember, he went to Ajanta. He was enamored by the Ajanta paintings, and he made a lot of case studies. In fact, the portraits of Dinkar Kaushik and Prithvish Neogi are actually made in that mode. But remember, he also left Shantiniketan. He didn't complete his course at Shantiniketan because he was bored. That's exactly what he writes. He was bored of the program, of the curriculum, and he thought that his real talent lies in commercial art. And again, if you look at the writings of O.C. Ganguly, for example, who is, of course, consciously Western in certain ways, you can feel that, somewhere the sensibility of Ray, has been shaped more by the advertising agencies and all. And he actually, his drawing, of course, his brushstrokes are, of course, you can see that there are probably references to Nandlal and Vinod Bihari in certain ways. But beyond that, I don't think, there is much. Okay, so it's a very curious. So how do you rate Ray as a graphic designer? Where do you place him as a graphic designer? And that's a question that I cannot answer. He's middle of the road. He's probably confused in a way. He never thought that his graphic design is good enough. He always wrote, and there are references where he's telling that, you cannot just, study my graphic design because they are not good enough. If you look at K.G. Subramaniam, he is actually trying to bring out the Shantiniketan sensibility that, that he showed in his work. But, all these are almost, I think, very superficial. I think we need a more what I call detailed study of Ray's graphic design, and probably from a graphic designer's point of view, because most of the time when we do a very academic study, the problem is we don't study the form too much. I'm okay with academic study, with the ideology of the implications of the design and of course the evolution of the design with respect to the art movements of the time. But it's also important to study the form, because if you don't know the idea of the form, I think we will always fall short. So thank you. I'm sorry for taking so much time, and I probably have bored most of you, but that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pinaki. That was riveting, to say the least.
Thank you.
But can we have comments and questions? You've already got accolades. If you look at the
I'm always because the people who are in my screen, two of them are my friends, Shayon and Gul. Other one.
Let the others ask questions.
I look up to these people, so I read them. So it's a bit odd. It's terrifying.
আমাদের প্রশ্নগুলো একটু উত্তর দাও।
I'll be trying to give it.
Bhaskar.
So this is just incredibly illuminating, but also immensely pleasurable. As someone who has pored over Sandesh and Anandamala pages, but I also really always was fascinated by the graphic design. So I have a set of 2 or 3 questions, and sorry, I won't be able to be quite articulate because I don't have the language sometimes to speak of what I'm trying to say. I have been fascinated, for instance, by the use of solid and translucent kind of colors in Ray. And I'm thinking, for instance, by translucent, Corvus.
Right.
If you remember the green face, right?
Right.
So with the rimmed glasses, and the crow in the background.
Right.
Would speak about that a little bit. But also, the other thing that came to mind as I was listening to you about, particularly reification and emergence and multi-stability, all those principles, for a director whose action sequences leave much more to be desired, you know, I have always marveled how his graphics
Right.
are so incredibly action-packed and dynamic. I'm thinking Royal Bengal, Rohosho, Koila Shekelankari, any of
amazing.
these films are many of this. So a little bit of that. And you mentioned, you know, a lot of folks like Ram Kinkar and, you know, Osi Ganguly. And so in an international circuit, say, someone like Saul Bass,
Yeah, Saul
where
Bass.
would you place his film posters in relation to someone like Bass?
Oh, so that's a big thing. I have actually done a paper on Saul Bass, and of course, Ray was influenced by Saul Bass. You can easily make out. So, for example, if you look at the beginning of Nayok, for example, have you seen the beginning of Nayok? It's very close to Albert's. I can show it to you because I have it with me. And I can also talk about three things. So there are three questions. So let me talk about three things because I want to show you certain things which probably you haven't seen ever. One is, of course, I'll take the second question first, which is basically action-packed. You know, the sequences that you can see. Ray is also, you know, very interested in the idea of sequentiality. And again, here my my intuition about, you know, comic narratives come to play. He never did comics. He did 4 what I called strips, which are actually the cover of Sandesh. So there are 4. But he actually did scripts with letters and with. So if you know that Pather Panchali script, you know, so the first Pather Panchali script, which we have curated now, which is actually produced, which was given to the producer. So when Ray was actually doing the Pather Panchali and pitching it to the producer, he thought that if you actually do it in a sequential way with the letters and with the, you know, with the action-packed graphics, you know, the very idea of dynamism thrown in, okay, it will probably do a bit of good. And of course, the famous Bhuter Nach scene, you know, is so action-packed. And I will show you something people probably don't know. The Kheror Khata of Gopika in Bhagavan is 100 odd, but the Bhuter Nach Khata is 180 pages. Can you believe it? And every moment, everything has been drawn out. So I'll just show you 2 things, and of course I'll answer all of your questions. But let me show you, because Moinagda has also told me to share certain things so that, you know, people can see these things, because I think these are things that people should know. So can you see me? Can you see me? Can you see my desktop?
Yeah, we can see your desktop.
Okay. Can you see? Okay, so what I'm trying to say, of course, this is the Pather Panchali script, which of course we have now brought out. It's called the Pather Panchali sketchbook, and you can see the way, you know, this is very unique. Again, I never saw brush strokes, because Ray, as I've told you, is a very hard lined, you know, no pun intended in a way. I mean, pun intended if you wish to do it that way. Hard lined designer. But here you can see the brush strokes, very unique, very dynamic, and you can see the comic style, you know, the kind of letters, you know, sorry, the cues of the story being talked about. And you can see the entire, so there are 54 pages, you can see the entire Pather Panchali story is actually done in this manner. And of course, there are camera references. So, you know, he was thinking in terms of sequentiality. It would be too much to say, but he was always thinking in terms of an action, and probably most in terms of forward action. So you always see that there is a kind, if you look at his brush strokes, for example, his brush strokes has a certain kind of a directional reference point to it, and that directional reference point is probably, you know, something that makes you think of action. So the very, you know, there is this meta idea of, you know, of the things that he's taking hold of, the brush, the paper, and the way he's actually daubing the brush, or taking the lines, taking the pen across the paper, the quill, for example, the crow quill pen across the paper. There is an inherent dynamism. So that part is almost there. So you can see this, but what is more interesting is the Ravi Shankar storyboard, which is not filmed, but if you look at it, it's almost silent, but you can see the kind of movement that, you know, he almost does in the Ravi Shankar sketchbook. Again, this was a film that's to be made, a kind of a documentary. It was never made, but what is very interesting is the kind of dynamism that you see. And this dynamism is there even when he draws hard lines. So, you know, normally when we do hard lines, there is this problem of, you know, getting stuck within the demands of the line. And so there is that lack of movement. But when say Feluda tumbles across, so one of the things by which he achieves this through hard line is the use of gestures and the way the angularity of the figures is played out in space altogether. So if you look at this one, I'll show you one sequence which I absolutely adore, which is like an intercut. So can you see this tabla and look at the way the medium shots and the long shots, the muddholoy, for example, and then of course the muddholoy of the sitar, and then the muddholoy from a different angle, and look at the low angle of the tabla and the hands, and then the muddholoy comes to drutoloy, and it just dobs brushstrokes across. So of course drutoloy is about being fast, but look at the way, and this kind of brushstrokes is something that you don't see in Shonku painting or don't see in Feluda. So when you see Corvus, you see a kind of probably that is where the translucent nature of the color becomes more important. Remember, he was also very aware of the demands of the printing industry, and he knew that earlier first of all, colors was not almost a no-no, because the magazines where this was being showed were almost like they didn't allow color to be played out that well. So when Anandamala came out and they wanted to do color, he was extremely happy. But he used very minimalist color, and he didn't want to create. So whenever say a Shonku adventure ideally should have a lot of what I call speed lines. So if you look at manga, for example, or these kind of drawings, action is actually talked about through speed lines. But if you look at Satyajit Ray, speed lines are almost not there. What you do have is, of course, the gesture, the body, the way he actually makes the body fill up the space within the paper in order to create a tilt, which actually makes you think that there is a bit of action. And I will show you that as well. So this is one thing I wanted to show you. I also wanted to show you another thing, but before that, let me show you a kind of a tilt that you see. So for example, this from Badshah Yanti. So there is no speed lines. So these are hard lines. So if you actually look at it, there is no movement. So either there should have been movements like that, no speed lines, but even then, the very idea, the angularity, sorry. So the angularity, if you look at the angularity and the way this, the golden mean is created, it actually creates that sense of the forward tumbling gesture of Feluda as he actually as he chases that person, is what creates that speed. So this is very, very interesting, that despite being hard lined in that sense, he can create speed without using speed lines. Or a better example is this. Now if you look at this, for example, Badshah Yanki, this is the original drawing from Sandesh, and he revised it, and when he revised it, he actually introduced some speed lines. But very interestingly, instead of the speed lines being in the foreground, it is more towards the background, and it's not like a speed line. It is actually something that is vertical in nature. So can you see? These are all vertical lines. So you can see that, you can feel the speed, you can see the action, you can see the whole thing. But that action is created from the foreground of from creating the foreground of Feluda figure leading up against a kind of a lined background, which is accentuating the act of leap that Feluda is taking from the Tanga. So these kind of things is something that you can see. So that's one part of the answer. And since I was talking of sequentiality, let me show you some of the Gupigain Bagabain Bhuter Nach Kheror Khata, where he, of course, I'll just go a bit fast. You can see how he's, of course, the very idea, he's actually making it out, he's making it the section, he's actually wiring out the movement. And look at this, is of course a man who would have done wonderful comics, but he didn't do comics, so there is a bit of regret here. But you can see the way the movement and even the the sleepers are being talked about, and the way the direction of the sleepers actually define the movement. So there are many things. Of course, there is a lot of musical notes which can be brought out from there as well. So that's one part of your answer. But the second part is the action. That's the action part. The second part, so I have this habit of forgetting. The first part is again the translucent color. Now, the translucent color, Ray actually had a theory about color, and very, very interesting. So whenever, I talked with Shekhar Mukherjee, one of Ray's collaborator, he was there with Ray, and he said that, he always used minimalist color. He never thought color is a very important constituent in the way a drawing actually, unfolds itself. Now, he's reticent about color, but the very idea of translucence is also related to the idea of three-dimensionality. Remember, if you look at Corvus, for example, look at the way the figure of Corvus is drawn. Now, Corvus is not drawn in a conventional manner. Now, if I can find that, I have it here with me, but if you look at the Corvus figure, it is actually made of, curious elliptical, shapes. Can you see the small elliptical shapes creating the figure of the magician, or, of the magician especially? So if you can look at it, and that itself creates a sense of three-dimensionality, but I think color adds to it. So if you look at so if you actually do solid opaque color, that very idea of putting those semicircular drawing style into action would be rendered just null and void. You cannot basically create that sense of three-dimensionality with a very opaque color, because if you have a very opaque like color, yes, so that's Corvus. Yes, this is Argus. If this is a magician, and if you look at the way the semicircular circles, and there is also another one where he's actually leaning up. Can you remember? He's leaning to look at it, and if you look at it, even that has that very idea of semicircular elliptical pathways creating that figure. So it's not a simplified figure. It's not just a figure that is made out of pure drawing, pure imaginative drawing. He is actually geometrically constructing the figure with something in mind, which is also about the otherness of Argus the magician. Remember, the otherness, because he wanted to accentuate the very, the serendipity of that person who is almost important, crucial to the story, and the way he almost hoodwinks the characters, of course, the readers in the story, tries to hoodwink the readers in the story. So that may be one of the reasons. One very interesting drawing that you can see in the later half of Ray's career is Swarnaporni. So if you look at Swarnaporni, for example, there is a beautiful picture of light filtering from the trees, where you can see, so I have it with me. That's one figure where he uses a lot of opaque color. That's much later part. He also uses translucent color in Mohakashe Dut. Again, where he could have used much more opaque colors. So one reason is three-dimensionality, probably creation of perspective. Otherwise, I cannot remember right now. But this is a very good point. I want to probably investigate a bit more further, because I'm very interested in Ray's use of color, and I haven't got anything substantial anywhere about Ray's usage of color. And there was another question. I'm this forgetful person who gets.
I think it's. We can go on to the next question, because we don't have.
It's just like me,
we don't have, unfortunately, much time left. This can go on forever.
I'm sorry.
Interesting, but
I'm like a
we are all listening with great interest.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
All of us. No, please don't be. Yeah. Please don't be. You're keep sort of showing us things and giving us kind of, commentaries, which are not easily found. I don't think I've come across this material on Ray anywhere.
Yes, I'm trying to do this in a more organized manner so that there is a book.
You don't have, a book would be very, very, very helpful. Monishita has a question, but I think we have to more or less close it in another 10 minutes.
Okay.
I don't have a question. A quick comment.
Okay.
A very quick comment or a suggestion. A book would be wonderful, but Pinaki, if we could have a film with the images, that would be fantastic.
Yes, in fact, probably an animation where you can actually see the way the shapes are actually adding up. So I am actually thinking of that. I have talked with one or two. I'm a very amateur animator. I am thinking of shapes, adding up. And remember, Bengali shapes are very, very interesting. In fact, Ray himself is a master of shapes. If you look at some of the titling of his films, a lot of shapes do, add up from, nowhere. So very, very interesting. Say some of the Feluda films, if you can see, look at the way the pistol, the Hoshokar becomes the pistol and all that, the way the shapes add up. But for this, I think we need to be like a shaper in order to create something really, really nice. Because otherwise, I think people will not understand, because it's very difficult to write about this. And whenever I write about this, it becomes so jargon filled, so full of, design principles that most of the people, get completely bored by that. So probably a film is a good idea. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Shayan has a, yeah.
Shayan Chaudhary has a question.
So,
is there time for one line?
Yes.
Shayan, please ask a question, because I'm also designing his cover. So wonderful.
No, just not that. Okay. Okay, just one very thing. I mean, Pinaki, it would be lovely if you I was just thinking that how his posters, given his obsession with order and his kind of sense of putting as much as possible of, so is what kind of relationship, you don't have to answer me, you can look at later, just between the film form and the graphic form with through posters. And because he of course is always designing, and some of these posters are incredibly interesting even for an amateur like us who kind of, so I'm sure you will, I mean, that's another session, but I would just suggest that it might be an interesting way to look at. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so I think that's what I'm looking at. In fact, even the title cards. In fact, if you look at the title cards, not only the posters, the booklets. So for example, in some of the films, he actually developed 3-4 booklets. Say, for example, if you look at the first Pather Panchali booklet, he actually did it for 3 times. And then he discarded all of them and he actually came up with something very different. He did almost 4 or 5 booklets, booklet design for almost every film. First of all, there is, of course, the French booklet that used to come up in the later part of his career. It was the English booklet, the international booklet that came out. And of course, the booklet for India. And there is also the question of audience in mind, the audience for which the booklet is meant, and that the design values also change. So if you look at the Charulata booklet for India and the Charulata booklet that is to be given the international audience, it actually raises very uncomfortable questions about, demarcation, the very hard demarcation that he used to do about the audience. And of course, there is this one bit of interview where he's telling that, sometimes Indian audiences can be very frustrating because, so the leap that he's taking in the international booklets compared to the booklets that he's doing for the international audience is very, very different. It calls to question the ideas of. So one booklet that you normally talk about, one booklet that you always talk about, is the Porosh Pathor booklet. And I don't know whether you have seen this. And you have seen the Indian version. So if you know the international version, you'll be surprised to see how contemporary it is. And I'll just show it once before I close, because this is something I want to show you, because since you raised this question, and it will be very fast. I have it, I think. So can you see the Porosh Pathor booklet? This is a folder design. So it's just an exclamation mark. Very minimalist, very different from the normal Porosh Pathor that you have for the Indian audience. In fact, the Indian Porosh Pathor is actually curiously modeled after Sukumar Rai's template of Allah de Atkhana. So remember all the 8 parts breaking up. So Porosh Pathor, you have that, and you have this tribute to Sukumar Rai in the Indian booklet. So he's also designing with audience in mind. Now that again, the question of audience is something that I haven't talked about. So I've talked mostly about form, and that's there in design as well. So there is also differences in the way he designs for the young adult and the way he designs for something else. Say, for example, the Feluda stories, and say, for example, the Shonku stories. The design changes, and he's like a chameleon. He can design everything. So if you look at the old works of Ray, like the Mallasri. I don't know whether you have seen all those stuff. It's curiously Eastern in nature. If you look at the Rupkatha that he's doing, in the Rajasthani style. And for example, the Avanindranath stories that he is doing, Raj Kahini that he is doing in Rajasthani style, and then he shifts suddenly to a very different style when he is doing, say, Jokhon Choto Chilam. He is almost demarcating he's almost varying his style according to the target audience he had his mind, almost like a mind of an advertiser in place. He knows to whom he is addressing it. And that is also very uncomfortable. Frankly, I also do that, but it also raises in me, and probably it had in Satyajit Ray, the very idea of design, whether design can be actually designed for audience, where design can be, made privy to certain audience in a certain way, I really don't know. These are comfortable. There are some comfortable and some uncomfortable questions to answer. So normally when we talk about, because look, I'm a fan, but as things have gone, I am trying to be less of a fan and more of a onlooker, and that has probably given me a more deeper understanding of Ray than previously, than before. And I haven't, if you look at his complex, have you seen his covers for Soumitra Chatterjee's Kobita Sankalan? Now, those are very different from what you see, so the covers that you see, say, for Param Purush Ramakrishna, or say, for example, the known covers, okay, they're completely different. They're just like, very postmodern in approach. It just zaps you. You can almost sometimes wonder whether the designer who designed, say, a Param Purush Ramakrishna can design that cover. He never developed the signature style. I mean, this is very, very interesting, and I was actually very inspired not to, define. One of the rarest quotes he gives about cover design is that he wants the design to fit into the content of the book, to show the content of the book. And since all the books are different in nature, he actually became a chameleon. He didn't put his signature all the way around. So when he's doing it for his own books, for example, there is a bit of a signature there. But he's doing Kobita books for Sudhindranath, or, for example, things for other people, that signature is almost gone. So if you look at his cover for orchestra, for example, for Sudhindranath Datto, it is very, very different from what he does for, say, for himself in the Feluda book. So this is what makes me this is what makes this design element of Ray very interesting.
Okay, unfortunately,
I'm sorry,
we have to bring this to a close.
Dipesh has a question, so can I?
Who has a question?
Dipesh.
Oh, Dipesh, where are you?
No, thank you. Yeah. It's really an uneducated question, because
please do. I mean, I read
your presentation completely opened up for somebody like me a side of Satyajit Ray that one only vaguely knew about. So this was extremely educated. But I was thinking, Pinaki, of Ray as a thinker of certain issues like motion. And so when you showed that sketch from Badshah Aunty,
right,
with the Feluda leaning forward,
right,
and the principle of balance is obviously there, the big figure being balanced with the small figure at a distance. But I was thinking, if you think of Satyajit as a thinker of motion,
right,
as distinct from a thinker of space. I mean, what you brought out very nicely was, like, for him, space had to be balanced, and that was something you clearly brought out very well. But clearly, he's also somebody interested in
motion,
thinking about motion, both motion in drawn pictures as well as in motion films, right? And clearly, animation is something that mediates the two.
Right.
So I was thinking, if you have, I mean, I have no thought, but it was a fascinating question. So
I think.
No, just for me, because what he comes out, and where I think it's very different from what Rochana was presenting, or what Manish, wonderful the presentation was, that you actually brought out Satyajit Ray as a thinker of forms.
Right. Yes.
And not Satyajit Ray thinker about society, not Satyajit Ray thinker about social justice or social problems. So normally when we debate Satyajit Ray, whether he's political or not, we think of the social content of the films and what they're saying. But what you brought out is also a man, like an artist, and a genius that he was, who actually thinks about forms and thinks about motion as a form, but motion being in motion. And so I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts about this, how this man thinks about motion.
So I didn't have too much to think about, and I'm writing a bit about his idea about sequentiality, where of course motion plays a very, very important role.
Yeah.
And of course, music, of course, mediates a lot of his, idea of motion in one way or the other.
And the whole Jhala sequence in the Ravi Shankar sketches.
Right. So Deepesh, I'm thinking about it, but of course, it's easier to read forms because he almost falls into certain categories. But with respect to motion, I think it will be a bit more complicated take. For example, if you look at the title cards, if you look at, for example, the Aranya Dinratri title cards. And if you see, the Aranya Dinratri title cards is actually about motion, but can you see the silhouette of the fonts that he created? If you look at the title cards, the fonts are very, are almost silhouetted, and within that fonts, the motion takes place. Right. And then again, then of course there is a very curious, mix of, that kinetic energy of the car moving across. And also, the letters with solid blocks almost sitting there within the title cards. Remember, it's a letter which is created specifically for the movie. Every letter is meticulously created, and we have those notes in the literary notebook. Every letter, Ko, Kho, Go, Go, he's almost created every letter curiously for the movie in order to nestle that, sequence of, movement. So if you remember Aranya Dinratri and the moving images coming up in the title, the very block of the geometric, the block-like shape of the letter somehow is in the foreground, but it seems that the letter are almost merging into one another into a kind of a kineticism which is very difficult to capture. So I have seen all these, and your idea, I think it will open up new idea, will make me think a bit more about motion, because this motion is extremely understated in Ray, in Ray's design. If you look at, say, for example, all his Shonku stories, all his Feluda stories are about adventures, right? Are about travels, right? And it's about motion, about, capturing the moment when there is something or, the other happening. So, for example, Moru Rahosya, if you look at that entire work, if you look at it, there's a lot of things happening. There is everything, related to motion and everything. So winds are blowing you out and everything. But, Satyajit doesn't use this motion lines to talk about motion, so that is where I think it's very, very interesting. But, it's not only gestures, you are right. It's not only gestures, it's not only balance, it's not only tilt, or it's not only space that makes him, create that motion. There must be something else. And let me think a bit. I mean, I will come back with something because something that I wish to add in my repertoire, because I'm still in a very nascent state, so it will take probably 3-4 years to develop a complete thing. But thank you so much for the.
No, thank you. This was wonderful. This was a great.
Thank you so much for the suggestion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pinaki. We unfortunately have to stop here. I would like to thank everyone. There's no vote. There's no formal vote of thanks because it sounds looks a bit odd on online platforms. But I want to
thank you. I want to thank you for putting this
that can
together.
happen.
We all want to thank you. Yes.
But I think there's one person who has to be mentioned especially separately, is Dattatreya Ghosh, who is a research scholar with the department, and from designing the poster to handling this live stream on YouTube and all these technical kind of paraphernalia, Dattatreya has been working behind the scenes constantly, rehearsing, doing tests, and finally pulling this whole complicated thing off. So thank you very much, Dattatreya. Once again, thank you, speakers, participants, for making it to the seminar. The recordings will be there on the YouTube links that I've sent you, or I'll send them again to you if you have lost those mails. There are YouTube links where if you want to refer to them later for your work or share it with friends and colleagues, the recordings of both the days will be available on YouTube. Okay. So with that, we'll say goodbye. Oh, one last announcement. Sorry. Actually, this is, as we said in the beginning, Anindo said yesterday, this is kicking off the centenary celebrations. We actually follow this 2-day seminar with a series of kind of single lectures. So, lectures, not really seminars in this format. So we'll soon contact you and tell you the final schedule of at least the preliminary first couple of months schedule for that. Some of the people who have agreed to give those lectures join this seminar, but the names will be revealed to you. I'll keep that as a suspense by and by. Let me see if all of them agree finally, but this will happen throughout the year. We'll leave some time aside for the elections in West Bengal, because that's going to be terribly chaotic and distracting, and also important because we are all focused on that from now on. So after that, say in May, we'll start the lecture series. I'll let you know in no time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Good night. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.